Welcome, dear listener, to a place of warmth and safety, where the flicker of firelight dances against stone walls, and the scent of wood smoke mingles with the earthy sweetness of pumpkin and treacle. Tonight, we journey together into the heart of the wizarding world, to a story woven with gentleness and strength, with loyalty and love, with creatures both misunderstood and magical. Tonight, we turn our attention to a soul as vast as the mountains and as tender as the first bloom of spring. A man whose hands could cradle a dragon's egg or mend a broken wing, whose heart held room for every lost and lonely thing. This is the story of Rubeus Hagrid. Let yourself settle now, dear listener, into the comfort of this tale. Let the weight of the day fall away, like autumn leaves drifting to the forest floor. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine yourself seated in a worn armchair before a crackling hearth, a thick quilt across your knees, and beyond the window, the forbidden forest stands silent beneath a sky sown with stars. The wind whispers through ancient branches, and somewhere in the distance, an owl calls softly to the night. Here, in this place between waking and dreaming, we will walk beside Hagrid from his very beginning, from the moment his story began in a world that did not always understand him, through his years of loss and discovery, and onward to the legacy he would leave behind, a legacy measured not in spells or status, but in kindness, in second chances, and in the creatures and children he protected with his life. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders soften, and let us begin. Our story begins not in a castle or a grand wizarding estate, but in a small, sturdy cottage tucked into the rolling green hills of the West Country of England, where magic and the mundane world brushed against each other like the edges of a dream. It was here, in the year 1928, on a cold December night, that Rubeus Hagrid was born, a child caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, yet destined to become a bridge between them. His father was a wizard, a man of modest means and quieter magic, a man whose name has been lost to history, but whose love was vast and uncomplicated. Hagrid's mother, however, was something else entirely. Her name was Fridwulfa, and she was a giantess, a towering figure from the mountains, a being of ancient lineage and fierce pride, standing some 20 feet tall when fully grown. How such a union came to be remains a mystery wrapped in the mists of time, a love story strange and improbable, and yet, as with so much in the magical world, it was real. The birth itself must have been a moment of wonder and terror both. Imagine, if you will, the tiny cottage straining at its seams, the midwife witch pale with shock, and Hagrid's father pacing outside beneath the winter stars, his wand clutched tight in trembling hands, and then a cry. Not the thin wail of an ordinary infant, but a sound robust and lusty, a cry that seemed to shake the very rafters. Rubeus Hagrid had arrived. From his very first breath, it was clear he was different. He was large, far larger than any wizarding baby had a right to be, and strong, his grip capable of bending the iron bars of his cradle. His eyes, dark and wide, held a curious gentleness even then, a softness that would define him all his life. His father, gazing down at his son for the first time, must have felt a complicated swell of emotion. Love, certainly, fierce and immediate, but also worry. The wizarding world was not always kind to those who were different, and his mother, Fridwulfa, what did she feel, holding her tiny giant of a son? We can only imagine. Giants, by their nature, are not creatures given to sentiment or softness. They value strength, dominance, the brutal hierarchy of their clans. A half-breed child, part wizard, and therefore weak in her eyes, may have been a disappointment to her, a shame she could not bear. For Fridwulfer did not stay. When Hagrid was but 3 years old, still a toddler tumbling through the cottage with surprising gentleness for his size, his mother left. She returned to the mountains, to the giant colonies hidden in the wild and unreachable places of the world, and she never came back. There were no letters, no messages, no backward glances. She simply vanished from his life as though she had been a dream, leaving behind only the legacy of Hagrid's great height, his tremendous strength, and a loneliness that would echo through the chambers of his heart for decades to come. Hagrid's father never spoke ill of her. He raised his son alone, with all the tenderness and patience a single parent could muster, but the question must have lingered in young Hagrid's mind as he grew. Why did she leave? Was I not enough? Childhood for Hagrid was a strange and lonely thing. He grew rapidly, far more rapidly than any wizard child, and by the time he was 6, he stood taller than most adults. His clothes needed constant mending and expanding. His boots wore through in weeks, and the cottage that had once seemed cozy now felt cramped and fragile around him, as though he might bring the whole structure tumbling down with one careless movement. But Hagrid learned to be careful. Despite his size, despite his strength, he moved through the world with a surprising gentleness, as though he understood instinctively that he could cause harm without meaning to. He learned to cradle things lightly, baby birds fallen from their nests, fragile teacups, his father's worn spellbooks. He learned to speak softly, though his voice naturally rumbled like distant thunder. He learned to make himself smaller somehow, in spirit if not in body, so as not to frighten others. The local children, both magical and non-magical, did not know what to make of him. They whispered and pointed, kept their distance, invented cruel games and crueler names. Hagrid bore it all with a quiet sadness, retreating often into the woods and fields that surrounded his home, where the trees did not judge and the creatures did not mock. It was here, in the wild and tangled places, that Hagrid found his first true friends. A family of hedgehogs nesting beneath a hedge, a fox with a wounded paw that he nursed back to health, a barn owl that roosted in the cottage eaves and hooted softly to him on sleepless nights. Animals, Hagrid discovered, did not care how tall he was or where his mother had gone. They cared only that his hands were gentle and his heart was kind. His father watched all this with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He taught Hagrid what magic he could: simple spells, household charms, the proper way to hold a wand. But it was clear that Hagrid's talents lay elsewhere. His magic was wild, unpredictable, often tied to his emotions. When he was happy, flowers bloomed unexpectedly in winter. When he was angry or upset, objects grew to enormous size or shattered without being touched. He could not seem to control it, and his father, though patient, worried. "You'll go to Hogwarts," his father told him one evening as they sat by the fire, Hagrid's legs too long now to fit comfortably beneath the table. "When you're 11, you'll go to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and they'll teach you properly. You'll learn to control your magic, Rubeus. You'll find your place." Hagrid clung to that promise like a lifeline. Hogwarts, a school for people like him. Well, not exactly like him, but magical at least. A place where he might belong. He dreamed of it at night, this castle he had never seen, imagining its towers and its grounds, its students and its secrets. But there was still time before that dream would come true. Years passed slowly in the cottage on the hill. Hagrid grew and grew and grew. His father aged more quickly than seemed fair, the strain of raising such an unusual child taking its toll. And in the year 1938, when Hagrid was 9 years old, his father fell ill. It was a quiet, creeping illness, the sort that steals strength and breath and leaves a person hollow. Hagrid, still a child himself despite his size, did everything he could. He brewed the potions his father instructed him to make. He kept the fire burning. He read aloud from books in his halting, careful voice. But magic, for all its wonders, could not stop the inevitable. His father died in the spring, when the hills were green and the world was waking. He died peacefully, holding Hagrid's enormous hand, and his last words were soft and sure. "You're a good lad, Rubeus. Don't let anyone tell you different." Hagrid buried his father in the garden beneath an oak tree, and for a time he was utterly alone. The summer after his father's death was the longest of Hagrid's life. He remained in the cottage, unsure of what else to do, tending the garden and caring for the animals, and waiting, though he did not quite know for what. The Ministry of Magic, upon learning of his father's passing, might have intervened, might have placed him in an orphanage or with distant relatives. But before any such arrangements could be made, a letter arrived. It came by owl, as all important letters do in the wizarding world, delivered on a morning in late July, when the sun hung golden over the hills and the air smelled of wild thyme and clover. The envelope was thick, addressed in emerald ink, and sealed with a purple wax stamp bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a serpent surrounding a large letter H. Hagrid's hands shook as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Hagrid, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." He read the letter 3 times, scarcely daring to believe it. Hogwarts. He was going to Hogwarts. His father's promise had not been empty. There was still a place for him in the world, still a future waiting. The rest of the letter detailed what he would need: robes, a wand, books, cauldron, the usual supplies, and included instructions for travelling to Diagon Alley in London. Hagrid had never been to London. He had never been anywhere, really, beyond the hills and the village. But now, clutching the letter to his chest, he felt a spark of something he had not felt in months: hope. The journey to London was overwhelming. The train, the crowds, the noise and speed and strangeness of it all left Hagrid dizzy and disoriented. But he followed the instructions carefully, and eventually he found himself standing before a grimy pub, wedged between a bookshop and a record store. A pub that the non-magical people streaming past seemed not to notice at all. The Leaky Cauldron. Inside, it was dim and warm and smelled of butterbeer and roasting meat. The patrons, witches and wizards all, glanced up as Hagrid entered, and more than a few stared openly. Even at 11, he was extraordinarily large, his head nearly brushing the low beams of the ceiling. But the barman, Tom, greeted him kindly enough and pointed him toward the back courtyard. "Tap the 3rd brick up. 2 across," Tom said. "And welcome to Diagon Alley." Lad Hagrid did as instructed, his borrowed wand, his father's old wand, feeling strange and unbalanced in his hand. He tapped the brick, and the wall began to shift and fold, revealing a narrow cobbled street that stretched away into a wonderland of magic. Diagon Alley. Shops lined both sides of the street, their windows glittering with cauldrons and broomsticks, spell books and potion ingredients, owls and cats and toads. Hagrid walked slowly, his eyes wide, trying to take it all in. Here, finally, was a place where magic was not hidden, where witches and wizards walked openly, where he was not the strangest thing around, though he was still, by far, the largest. He visited Flourish and Blots for his books, Madame Malkin's for robes, which required significant alteration, and the apothecary for potion supplies. But the most important stop, the one he had been both anticipating and dreading, was Ollivander's, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. The shop was narrow and dusty, stacked floor to ceiling with long, thin boxes. A single tinkling bell announced his arrival, and moments later, an elderly man with wide silvery eyes appeared from the back. "Good afternoon," said Mr. Ollivander. "Ah, yes, you'll be young Hagrid, I expect. I was sorry to hear about your father. He purchased his wand here, 10 inches, oak, reasonably springy, dragon heartstring core. Good for charm work." Hagrid nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Well, then," Ollivander continued briskly, "let's find your wand, shall we? Hold out your arm. Wand arm, that's it." What followed was a lengthy and somewhat frustrating process. Wand after wand was tried and rejected, each producing either feeble sparks or alarming explosions. Ollivander muttered to himself, pulling boxes from higher and higher shelves, his expression growing more intrigued. "Tricky customer, eh?" he said at last, and there was a gleam in his eye. "Not to worry, we'll find the right match. Ah, yes. Let's try this one. 16 inches. Oak. English oak. Very traditional. With a core of, well, let's just say something rather robust." He handed Hagrid the wand, and the moment his fingers closed around it, he felt it. A warmth that spread up his arm, a sense of rightness, of connection. He gave it a tentative wave, and a shower of golden sparks erupted from the tip, swirling through the shop like fireflies. "Oh, bravo!" Ollivander cried, clapping his hands. Yes, very good indeed. 16 inches, rather bendy oak and, well, the core is a rather unusual choice, but it seems to have chosen you. Take care of it, Mr. Hagrid. The wand chooses the wizard, remember? It's not always clear why Hagrid left the shop in a daze, his new wand carefully wrapped, his heart full to bursting. He was really going to Hogwarts. He was really a wizard. Perhaps, he thought, as he made his way back through the bustling alley, perhaps he might finally find where he belonged. September 1st arrived with all the golden warmth of early autumn. Hagrid made his way to King's Cross Station, his trunk, comically oversized, floating along behind him with a levitation charm he'd managed only on the third try. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 seemed impossibly solid, but he took a breath, remembered the instructions, and walked straight toward it and through. Platform 9 3/4 was chaos and magic in equal measure. The scarlet steam engine gleamed beneath a canopy of enchanted mist. Families said their goodbyes. Owls hooted from their cages, and the air buzzed with excitement and nervousness. Hagrid climbed aboard, ducking his head beneath the compartment doorways, trying to find a seat. Most compartments were full, or filled quickly once students caught sight of him. He tried not to feel hurt by the way children whispered and parents pulled their sons and daughters closer. He was used to it. Finally, he found an empty compartment near the back and settled himself as comfortably as he could, His knees pressed against the opposite seat. The train lurched forward with a great whoosh of steam, and London began to slip away, replaced by countryside rolling green and gold beneath the afternoon sun. Hagrid pressed his face to the window, watching the world go by, his heart hammering with anticipation. Somewhere ahead, beyond the hills and the horizon, Hogwarts was waiting. Though he could not yet know it, could not yet imagine the joys and heartbreaks that awaited him there, the friendships and betrayals, the creatures he would love, and the injustices he would endure. Hagrid felt, for the first time since his father's death, something very much like happiness. The train rumbled northward through the fading light, carrying him toward his destiny. And as the stars began to appear one by one in the deepening sky, Rubeus Hagrid allowed himself to hope. The Hogwarts Express travelled through the night like a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness, carrying its cargo of young witches and wizards ever northward toward their destiny. Hagrid dozed fitfully in his compartment, his large frame too awkward for the narrow seats, his dreams filled with images of the castle he had never seen but had imagined 1,000 times. When he finally woke, it was to the sound of excited voices in the corridor and the conductor's call. Hogwarts! Hogwarts Station! All students disembark. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, Hagrid gathered his belongings and shuffled toward the exit, his trunk bumping along behind him. The platform was dark, save for the glow of enchanted lanterns swaying in the cool September breeze, and the air smelled of pine and ancient stone and something else, something magical that he couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. First years over here, a voice boomed across the platform, and Hagrid turned to see a tall wizard with a magnificent beard holding a lantern aloft. The first years clustered nervously around him, their faces pale and excited in the lamplight, and Hagrid hurried to join them. Though even at 11, he stood a full head taller than the adult wizard leading them. "All right then," the wizard said, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Hagrid's unusual size, but his voice remained warm. "Follow me. Mind your step now. The path can be a bit tricky in the dark." They walked single file down a narrow, winding path, through dense forest, the trees pressing close on either side, their branches whispering secrets to the night. Hagrid's heart raced. Somewhere ahead, through the darkness, Hogwarts waited, and then, suddenly, the trees fell away, and there it was, the castle. It rose before them like something out of a dream, vast and ancient, its towers reaching toward the star-scattered sky, its windows glowing with warm golden light, its turrets and battlements, and impossible architecture defying everything Hagrid knew about buildings. It perched on a cliff above a great black lake, and the lake reflected the castle's lights like scattered jewels on dark velvet. "No more than 4 to a boat," the wizard called, and Hagrid saw them then, little wooden boats bobbing gently at the water's edge, waiting. Most of the first years scrambled into boats in groups of 3 or 4, chattering nervously. But when Hagrid approached, the boats seemed suddenly very small. He climbed carefully into one alone, and it sank low in the water beneath his weight, but held steady. With a word from the wizard, the fleet of boats began to glide across the lake, moving smoothly and silently, as though pulled by invisible hands. Hagrid trailed his fingers in the cold water and stared up at the castle growing larger and larger before him. The stars wheeled overhead. An owl called somewhere in the forest behind them. And for a moment, just a moment, Hagrid felt as though he were exactly where he was meant to be. The boats carried them through a curtain of ivy concealing a wide opening in the cliff face, through a dark tunnel, and finally to an underground harbour where they disembarked onto a stone landing. They climbed a long flight of steps, pushed through an enormous oak door, and found themselves in an entrance hall so vast and magnificent that several first years gasped aloud. Torches blazed in brackets along stone walls hung with tapestries depicting great magical battles and legendary beasts. A marble staircase swept upward to the floors above, and the ceiling. Was there even a ceiling? It seemed to disappear into shadow and starlight. Hagrid stood very still, hardly daring to breathe, trying to memorize every detail. A stern-looking witch in emerald robes appeared to greet them, her expression serious but not unkind. She explained briefly what would happen next: the sorting ceremony, the 4 houses, the importance of house unity, and then led them through a side door into a small chamber to wait. Hagrid's stomach twisted with nervousness. Which house would he be sorted into? Gryffindor, known for bravery; Ravenclaw, for cleverness; Hufflepuff, for loyalty; or Slytherin, for ambition. He didn't feel particularly brave or clever or ambitious. Loyal, perhaps. He hoped he was loyal. The nervous chatter of the other students washed over him, but Hagrid remained quiet, his mind racing. And then, sooner than he expected, the doors opened, and they were led into the Great Hall. If the entrance hall had been magnificent, the Great Hall was beyond words. 4 long tables stretched the length of the room, already filled with older students whose faces turned to watch the first years enter. Thousands of candles floated in mid-air, their flames steady and bright, and above them Hagrid had to stop himself from stumbling. Above them was the sky itself, not a ceiling painted to look like the sky, but the actual night sky. Stars glittering, wispy clouds drifting, the moon sailing serene and silver overhead. "It's bewitched," whispered a girl beside him, "to look like the sky outside. I read about it in Hogwarts." A history. Hagrid barely heard her. He was too busy staring, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with wonder. This was real. This was all real. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sat the staff table, and in the center, in a high-backed golden chair, sat a wizard with auburn hair and a long beard, his expression kindly and watchful. Headmaster Armando Dippet, Hagrid knew from his letter. And beside him, a younger professor with auburn hair shot through with silver, his eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement behind half-moon spectacles. Albus Dumbledore, the Transfiguration professor. The first years lined up nervously before the staff table, and Hagrid found himself at the back of the line, towering over everyone. On a stool before them sat an ancient, patched wizard's hat, pointed and floppy and seemingly quite ordinary, except that it suddenly split open near the brim, like a mouth, and began to sing. The Sorting Hat's song welcomed them to Hogwarts, described the qualities of each house, and promised to place each student where they would thrive. When it finished, the hall erupted in applause, and the stern witch, Professor McGonagall's predecessor perhaps, began to call names alphabetically from a long roll of parchment. One by one, students approached the stool, sat down, had the hat placed on their heads, and after a moment, or sometimes several minutes, the hat would shout out a house name: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Slytherin. Each announcement was met with cheers from the corresponding table. Hagrid, Rubeus. His name seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Hagrid walked forward, his footsteps heavy on the stone floor, acutely aware that every eye in the hall was on him. He sat on the stool, which creaked alarmingly, and the hat was lowered onto his head. It slipped down over his eyes, too large even for him, and everything went dark. "Well, well, well," said a small voice in his ear, or perhaps in his mind. "What have we here? A giant son, if I'm not mistaken, and such a tender heart too. Interesting, very interesting." Hagrid held his breath. "You've known loss, young one, known loneliness, but you've also known love. Your father's love, the love you give so freely to creatures and growing things. You are loyal to your core, that much is certain. Hufflepuff would welcome you gladly. And yet, there is something else here. Courage. Yes, courage. The courage to be kind in a world that is often cruel. The courage to care when caring makes you vulnerable." The hat seemed to hum thoughtfully. "Yes, I know where you belong. Better be. Gryffindor." The hat's final word rang out across the hall, and the table beneath the golden and scarlet banners exploded into applause. Hagrid removed the hat with shaking hands, handed it carefully to the next student, and made his way to the Gryffindor table in a daze. His housemates shifted to make room for him, clapping him on the back, grinning up at him. "Welcome to Gryffindor," said a 6-year boy with a wide smile. "You'll love it here, mate." "Best house in the school." Hagrid smiled back, his heart swelling. Gryffindor. He was a Gryffindor. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences. Gryffindor Tower, reached by climbing seemingly endless staircases, many of which moved without warning, and past a portrait of a rather stern, fat lady who demanded a password, became Hagrid's home. The common room was warm and welcoming, decorated in crimson and gold, with squashy armchairs clustered around a roaring fireplace, and windows that looked out over the Hogwarts grounds. The dormitory he shared with 4 other first-year boys was cozy, though his bed had to be magically enlarged to accommodate him. His roommates were friendly enough, curious about his size certainly, but not cruel. One of them, a cheerful boy named Herbert, liked to talk about Quidditch endlessly. Another, a quiet boy named Edmund, was fascinated by Hagrid's giant heritage and asked politely if Hagrid had ever met another giant. "Just me mum," Hagrid said quietly, "but she left when I was little. Don't remember her much." Edmund had the grace to look embarrassed and didn't bring it up again. Classes were harder than Hagrid had expected. His wand work was clumsy. Spells seemed to explode out of him rather than flow smoothly. And more than once, he accidentally shattered a teacup in Transfiguration or sent a feather rocketing into the ceiling during charms rather than levitating it gently. Professor Dumbledore watched him with those twinkling eyes, patient and encouraging. But Hagrid could see the concern there too. "Magic, Mr. Hagrid," Dumbledore said after one particularly disastrous lesson where Hagrid had accidentally turned his desk into a bush, "is as much about control and intention as it is about power. You have power in abundance. Control will come with time and practice." Hagrid nodded miserably, but privately he wondered if control would ever come at all. History of magic was taught by a ghostly professor who droned on endlessly about goblin rebellions and giant wars, his voice a monotonous lullaby that sent half the class into stupor. Potions was taught in the dungeons by a sallow-faced wizard who clearly had no patience for students who confused powdered moonstone with powdered silver, as Hagrid did on more than one occasion. But then there was care of magical creatures. The class was taught by Professor Sylvanus Kettleburn, a wizard who had lost so many limbs to various creature-related accidents that he now sported several prosthetic arms and legs, each more eccentric than the last. He was enthusiastic to the point of recklessness, constantly introducing students to creatures that other professors considered far too dangerous for children. Hagrid loved him immediately. Their first lesson involved feeding Neasels, intelligent cat-like creatures with spotted fur and lion-like tails. While most students hung back nervously, Hagrid knelt in the grass and let the Neasels sniff his enormous hands. Within minutes, 3 of them were purring and rubbing against him, and Professor Kettleburn beamed. "Natural talent, Hagrid," he boomed. "Creatures can sense kindness, you know. They can sense a good heart. Well done indeed." From that day forward, care of magical creatures became Hagrid's sanctuary. He spent every spare moment near the creature paddocks or helping Professor Kettleburn with feeding and grooming. He learned the proper way to approach a hippogriff. Never break eye contact, bow, wait for them to bow back. He learned how to tickle a flobberworm. Though they were so boring, he felt rather sorry for them. He learned the diet of salamanders and the temperament of auguries and the mating habits of firecrabs. The creatures, unlike many of his classmates, never judged him. They didn't care that he was too large or too clumsy with a wand. They cared only that he was gentle and patient and kind. It was in his second year that Hagrid met Tom Riddle. Tom was a 5th-year Slytherin, a prefect with dark hair and handsome features, and a smile that could charm even the strictest professors. He was brilliant, top of his class in nearly every subject, and well liked by students and staff alike. He had a way of making you feel important when he spoke to you, as though you were the only person in the world who mattered. Hagrid encountered him one evening in the library, struggling with an essay on the properties of dragon blood for potions class. Hagrid had filled half a scroll with what he was sure was complete nonsense, and he was on the verge of giving up entirely when a smooth voice spoke from behind him. "Having trouble, Hagrid?" He turned to find Tom Riddle standing there, his arms full of books, his expression friendly and curious. "Yeah," Hagrid admitted, flushing. "I'm rubbish at potions. Can't seem to get the hang of it." Tom set his books down and glanced at Hagrid's essay. "May I?" At Hagrid's nod, he scanned the parchment, his lips quirking in a small smile. "Not rubbish at all. Just needs a bit of reorganization. Here, you've got the right information, just in the wrong order. Dragon blood has 12 uses, according to Dumbledore's research. But for this essay, Professor Slughorn wants you to focus on its use in alchemy and potion making specifically." He spent the next 20 minutes helping Hagrid restructure his essay, his explanations clear and patient. By the end, Hagrid had a much better essay and a swell of gratitude toward this older student who had taken the time to help him. "Thanks," Hagrid said earnestly. "That's real kind of ye, Tom." "Not at all," Tom said, smiling. "I like helping people. And besides, I've always been fascinated by those who have a natural affinity for magical creatures. Professor Kettleburn speaks very highly of you." Hagrid's face went red with pleasure. "Does he?" "Oh, yes. He says you have a gift. Rare, that. Most wizards fear creatures, or try to dominate them. But you understand them, don't you? Hagrid nodded slowly. Yeah, I suppose I do. They're not so different from people, really. Jusses want to be understood, want to be treated with respect. Tom's eyes glittered with something Hagrid couldn't quite identify. Exactly, he said softly. Exactly right. After that, Tom Riddle made a point of speaking to Hagrid whenever they crossed paths. He asked about the creatures Hagrid was studying, listened with apparent fascination to Hagrid's enthusiastic explanations, and even invited him to a meeting of the Slug Club. Though Hagrid, intimidated by the sophisticated older students there, had felt completely out of place and never returned. But Tom's attention was flattering. For someone who had spent most of his life being ignored or mocked, having a popular, brilliant older student treat him as a friend felt wonderful. Hagrid began to think of Tom as something like the older brother he'd never had. He didn't notice the way Tom's questions sometimes had a calculating edge. He didn't notice how Tom's interest in dangerous creatures seemed less academic and more acquisitive. He didn't notice because he trusted too easily, because his heart was too open, because he wanted so badly to believe that someone like Tom Riddle could genuinely care about someone like him. It was a trust that would, in time, destroy everything. It began with an egg. Hagrid was 14 in his 3rd year when he found it, or rather, when it was given to him. He'd been in Hogsmeade on a weekend visit, browsing the shops and dreaming of creatures he might one day care for, when a strange wizard in a dark cloak approached him in the Hog's Head Inn. "You're the Hagrid boy, aren't you?" the man said, his voice raspy. The one who's good with creatures. Hagrid nodded warily. The man reached into his robes and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I came across this," he said, "but I have no use for it, and it seems a shame to waste it. Thought you might be interested." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal an egg, a large egg about the size of a melon, with a soft, leathery shell that gleamed faintly in the dim light of the pub. "What is it?" Hagrid breathed, already reaching for it. "Acromantula," the man said. "Rare as hen's teeth they are. Illegal to breed in Britain, mind you. But, well, between you and me, they're magnificent creatures. Misunderstood, like so many others." He pressed the egg into Hagrid's hands and left before Hagrid could ask anything more. Hagrid knew he should turn the egg in to a professor. Acromantulas were classified as XXXXX by the Ministry, known wizard killers, highly dangerous, not to be trusted. But as he cradled the egg in his large hands, feeling the warmth of it, sensing the life inside, he couldn't bring himself to let it go. He smuggled it back to the castle in his coat, hid it in a box under his bed, and waited. 3 weeks later, the egg hatched. The creature that emerged was small, no bigger than Hagrid's fist, with 8 spindly legs and multiple black eyes that glittered with intelligence. An acromantula spiderling. Hagrid had read about them in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, knew they could grow to enormous size, knew they were dangerous. But this one was so small, so helpless, looking up at him with what Hagrid swore was trust. "Hello," Hagrid whispered. "I'll call you Aragog." He fed Aragog scraps of meat from the kitchens, kept him hidden in a box that he enlarged with a charm Professor Dumbledore had taught him, and talked to him every night before bed. Aragog grew quickly. Acromantulas always did, and within months, he was the size of a small dog, his mandibles clicking softly, when Hagrid entered the dormitory. Keeping him secret was becoming more difficult. His roommates had started to notice the strange noises, the smell of meat going off, the way Hagrid was always sneaking in and out at odd hours. But Hagrid couldn't give him up. Aragog was his friend, his responsibility. And then, in the spring of his 3rd year, everything fell apart. It started with whispers in the corridors, in the common rooms, whispers that something terrible was happening at Hogwarts. Students were being attacked, found petrified, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their bodies rigid as stone. No one knew what was doing it. No one knew who would be next. The professors were frightened, though they tried to hide it. Lessons continued, but the castle felt different, darker, more oppressive, as though the very stones were holding their breath. And then, on a cold night in early June, a girl died. Her name was Myrtle Warren, a Ravenclaw student, unpopular and lonely, often found crying in the 2nd-floor girls' bathroom. She was found dead in that very bathroom, her body sprawled on the wet floor, her eyes wide and glassy. The castle erupted into panic. Parents threatened to withdraw their children. The ministry became involved. Headmaster Dippet announced that unless the perpetrator was found, Hogwarts would be closed. Hagrid was terrified, not for himself, but for the castle, for the only home he'd ever known. If Hogwarts closed, where would he go? Back to the empty cottage, into the Muggle world where he fit even less. And then Tom Riddle came to him. "Hagrid," he said urgently, finding Hagrid alone near the Forbidden Forest one evening. "I need to talk to you. It's about the attacks." "What about them?" Hagrid asked. Tom glanced around, making sure they were alone. "I think I know what's doing it," he said quietly. "I think it's a monster someone has been keeping hidden in the castle." Hagrid's blood ran cold. "What kind of monster?" "Something dangerous, something that kills." Tom paused. "Hagrid, I know you've been keeping a creature, an acromantula. I've heard things, and I know you'd never let it hurt anyone, but others might not see it that way, if the wrong person finds out." "Aragog wouldn't hurt anyone," Hagrid said desperately. "He's gentle, I swear it." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Acromantulas were predators. Aragog was growing larger every day. Could he have gotten out somehow? Could he have? Number. It wasn't possible. Aragog was his friend. But before Hagrid could say anything more, there were voices, footsteps, and suddenly Professor Dippet was there, along with several other professors, their wands drawn. "Rubeus Hagrid," Dippet said gravely, "you are accused of opening the Chamber of Secrets and releasing the monster within. You are accused of causing the death of Myrtle Warren." "No," Hagrid shouted. "No, I didn't. It wasn't me." But they'd already found Aragog, hidden in Hagrid's dormitory. The enormous spider, frightened by the commotion, had clicked his mandibles threateningly, and it was all the proof they needed. Hagrid was dragged to the headmaster's office, Aragog confiscated, and in a whirlwind of accusations and frightened staff and ministry officials, his fate was sealed. He was expelled from Hogwarts, his wand snapped in half before his eyes, the sharp crack of breaking wood like a physical blow to his heart. He tried to protest, tried to explain that Aragog wasn't the monster, that he hadn't opened any chamber, but no one listened. They wanted someone to blame, and Hagrid, large, half-giant, keeper of a dangerous creature, was an easy target. Through it all, Tom Riddle watched from the shadows, his expression sympathetic, his dark eyes unreadable. The last thing Hagrid did before leaving the castle was set Aragog free in the Forbidden Forest, tears streaming down his face as the giant spider disappeared into the darkness. "I'm sorry," Hagrid whispered. "I'm so sorry, Aragog." And Aragog, in his clicking, hissing voice, made a promise. "I will never harm you, Hagrid. You are my friend, my only friend." Then he was gone, and Hagrid, 13 years old, his wand broken, his dream shattered, was escorted from Hogwarts in disgrace, while the real monster and the real villain remained hidden in the shadows, safe and unsuspected. The summer after Hagrid's expulsion was the darkest time of his young life. He returned to the empty cottage in the West Country, the place where his father had raised him, where he had once felt safe, but now the rooms felt hollow and haunted by memories. He was 13 years old, cast out from the only place he had ever truly belonged. His wand, his father's wand, destroyed, his future uncertain as morning mist. The ministry had been clear. He was not to perform magic. His education was over. He was, in the eyes of magical law, a squib now, someone with magical blood but no right to use it. The injustice of it burned in Hagrid's chest like hot coals. But what could he do? Who would listen to a half-giant boy accused of murder? He spent his days walking the hills, visiting the places where he and his father had once gathered herbs or watched for fairies, and his nights lying awake, wondering what would become of him. Would he live out his days in the cottage, alone and forgotten? Would he be forced into the Muggle world, where his size and strangeness would mark him forever as an outcast? And then, on a morning in late July when the heather was blooming purple across the hills, an owl arrived. It was a magnificent tawny owl, regal and patient, and it carried a letter sealed with the Hogwarts crest. Hagrid's hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, the words measured and kind. "Dear Rubeus, I hope this letter finds you well, or as well as can be expected, given the difficult circumstances of recent months. I write to you with a proposition that I hope you will consider carefully. I have never believed, not for one moment, that you opened the Chamber of Secrets, nor that you had any hand in the tragic death of Miss Warren. I know your heart, Rubeus, and I know that you are incapable of such cruelty. Unfortunately, in times of fear, justice is often the first casualty, and I was unable to convince my colleagues or the Ministry of your innocence. However, I'm now headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and in this capacity, I have certain authorities. While I cannot restore your wand or reinstate you as a student, these decisions lie beyond even my power. I can offer you something else. I would like to offer you the position of Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts. You would live on the grounds, care for the castle and its surrounding lands, and assist with the maintenance of our many magical creatures. It is honest work, important work, and it would allow you to remain in the place I know you love. You need not answer immediately. Take time to think, but know that you would be welcomed, Rubeus, and that Hogwarts will always be your home if you wish it. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore." Headmaster Hagrid read the letter 3 times, his eyes blurring with tears. Dumbledore believed him. Dumbledore knew he was innocent. And more than that, Dumbledore was offering him a lifeline, a way back to the only place that had ever felt like home. He wrote his acceptance that very day, his handwriting large and clumsy but heartfelt, and within a week, He was back at Hogwarts this time, not as a student, but as something else, something permanent. He was given a hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, a small wooden structure with a single room, a large fireplace, and windows that looked out toward the castle on one side and the dark trees on the other. It was simple, rustic, but to Hagrid, it was perfect. He moved in his few belongings, his father's old books, some clothes, a copper kettle, and set about making it home. Professor Dumbledore, Headmaster Dumbledore now, visited him that first evening, bringing a gift, a pink umbrella. "I thought you might find this useful," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes twinkling. The weather can be unpredictable. On the grounds, Hagrid took the umbrella, confused for a moment. And then he understood. The umbrella was heavier than it should be, and when he held it, he felt the faint familiar hum of magic. Hidden within the umbrella's shaft were the pieces of his broken wand, reassembled in secret, disguised so that the Ministry would never know. "Sir," Hagrid whispered, overwhelmed. "Yes, shouldn't have. If they found out, then we shall simply have to ensure they don't." Dumbledore said calmly, "You were treated unjustly, Rubeus. I cannot undo what was done, but I can give you this small measure of your dignity back. Use it wisely, use it quietly, and use it well." Hagrid nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. From that day forward, Rubeus Hagrid was the keeper of keys and grounds of Hogwarts, and he poured every ounce of his considerable heart into the role. The grounds of Hogwarts were vast and varied, and Hagrid set about learning every inch of them with the dedication of a pilgrim memorizing sacred texts. There were the manicured lawns that stretched from the castle to the greenhouses, kept trim by a combination of magic and careful tending. There were the vegetable gardens that supplied the kitchens, the flower beds that bloomed in impossible colours, and the ancient trees, oaks and beeches and rowans, that had stood for centuries, their roots deep in magical soil. And then there was the Forbidden Forest. The forest was older than the castle itself, a place of deep shadow and deeper magic, where creatures both wondrous and dangerous made their homes. It was forbidden to students for good reason. Centaurs dwelt in its heart, territorial and proud. Acromantulas spun their webs in its darkest corners. Hagrid wondered if Aragog had survived, if he had found others of his kind. Werewolves sometimes sheltered there during the full moon, and unicorns, those most pure and magical of creatures, grazed in its moonlit glades. Hagrid learned the forest, slowly, carefully, with the respect it demanded. He learned which paths were safe and which led to danger. He learned the territories of the centaur herds, learned to recognize their leaders and to greet them with courtesy, even when they regarded him with suspicion. He learned where the unicorns preferred to drink, and he began leaving out offerings, clean water in stone basins, salt licks, bundles of herbs, so that they would grow accustomed to his presence. He learned to read the signs, broken branches that indicated something large had passed, tracks in the soft earth, the particular silence that meant a predator was near. He learned the language of the forest, not words exactly, but a deeper understanding, an instinct for when things were in balance and when they were not. And the creatures, in time, learned to trust him. Professor Kettleburn, still teaching care of magical creatures, was delighted to have Hagrid's help. Together, they tended to the school's collection of creatures, the hippogriffs in their paddock, proud and dangerous and beautiful. The thestrals in the forest, visible only to those who had seen death. Their skeletal forms both eerie and gentle. The salamanders in the greenhouses, thriving in the magically maintained fires, and dozens of others. Hagrid absorbed everything. He learned how to trim a hippogriff's talons without losing a finger, how to feed a thestral so it would eat from your hand, how to recognize when a unicorn was ill, how to calm a frightened Kneasel. His size, once a source of shame, became an asset. He could lift heavy bales of hay with ease, repair fences that would take 3 men to handle, and carry injured creatures to safety when smaller wizards would have struggled. The years passed, and Hagrid grew into his role. His body filled out, his shoulders broadening, his beard growing wild and thick. By the time he was 20, he stood nearly 12 feet tall, his hands like shovels, his strength legendary among the staff. But his heart remained as gentle as ever, and the creatures knew it. Students came and went, generation after generation. Hagrid watched them from a distance, his expulsion still a source of shame, wondering sometimes what house they were sorted into, what they learned, whether any of them loved Hogwarts as much as he did. He rarely entered the castle itself. His domain was the grounds, the forest, the wild places. But sometimes, on the quiet evenings, he would stand at the edge of the lake and look up at the lit windows, remembering what it had felt like to belong there. Hagrid's hut became a place of refuge for injured and abandoned creatures. Word seemed to spread somehow, perhaps through the forest itself, through some network of animal understanding, that the giant who lived in the wooden house would help if you were hurt or lost. He mended broken wings and set broken legs. He nursed sick owls back to health and released them when they were strong. He found a 3-legged fox caught in a trap and kept her through the winter, feeding her and talking to her until she was well enough to return to the wild. He rescued a family of bowtruckles whose tree had been struck by lightning, housing them temporarily in a matchbox filled with woodlice until he could relocate them to a suitable oak. And then there was Fang. Fang arrived on a stormy October night when Hagrid was in his 30s, a filthy, half-starved boarhound puppy whimpering at his door. Hagrid took him in without hesitation, fed him warm milk and scraps of meat, and cleaned the mud and burrs from his fur. The puppy, despite his massive breed, was a coward, frightened of thunder, frightened of loud noises, frightened of his own shadow, but loyal and loving beyond measure. "I'll call you Fang," Hagrid said, scratching the puppy behind his enormous ears, "on account of your teeth, even if you haven't got the heart to use them." Fang became his constant companion, sleeping by the fire, following Hagrid on his rounds, and providing comfort on lonely nights when the wind howled through the trees and Hagrid felt the weight of his solitude pressing down like a physical thing. Because for all his love of creatures, for all his contentment with his work, Hagrid was lonely. He had acquaintances among the staff. Professor Kettleburn, who was always friendly, the gamekeeper before Hagrid, who had retired to Devon, the house elves in the kitchen, who saved him leftovers, but few true friends. He was too different, too large, too associated with the tragedy that had once nearly closed the school. So he poured his love into the creatures instead, and they, at least, never judged him. He began breeding toads in a small pond behind his hut, experimenting with different varieties, trying to create the perfect specimen for use in potions class. He raised salamanders in enchanted fires, carefully regulating the temperature so they would thrive. He even, against all regulations and common sense, acquired a dragon egg. It happened in the spring of 1992. Though, of course, Hagrid didn't know how significant that year would be when it began. He had gone to Hogsmeade for a drink at the Hogshead, a rare indulgence, as Hagrid was not much of a drinker, and found himself in conversation with a hooded stranger who claimed to have something rare for sale. "Dragon egg," the stranger said in a low voice. "Norwegian ridgeback." Interested, Hagrid's heart leapt. A dragon. He had dreamed of dragons since he was a boy, had read everything he could find about them, had memorized their species and habitats and behaviors. To actually raise one, even briefly, would be the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. "How much?" he asked, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. The stranger named a price, steep, but Hagrid had been saving his wages for years, living simply, spending little. He had enough, barely. The transaction was quick and illegal, and probably unwise, but Hagrid clutched the egg to his chest as he walked back to the castle, his mind already racing with plans. Where would he keep it? What would he feed it? How long until it hatched? He placed the egg in the fire to keep it warm, rotating it carefully several times a day, watching and waiting. And then, one evening when spring rain drummed against the roof, the egg began to crack. Hagrid watched in breathless wonder as the shell split, as a small snout emerged, as the dragon, black and spiny and perfect, fought its way into the world. It was no bigger than a cat, its wings crumpled against its sides, its eyes blinking in the firelight. "Hello, Norbert," Hagrid whispered, tears streaming into his beard. "Welcome home." He fed Norbert rats and brandy mixed with chicken blood, watched him grow at an alarming rate, taught him to recognize his name, or tried to. Norbert was not particularly bright. Within weeks, the dragon was the size of a large dog, breathing fire that scorched the wooden furniture, knocking over tables with his thrashing tail. Hagrid knew he couldn't keep him forever. Dragons were dangerous, illegal to own, and Norbert was growing larger every day. But he couldn't bring himself to let go. Not yet, just a little longer. It took the intervention of 3 first-year students, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger, to make him see reason. And even then, saying goodbye to Norbert, who turned out to be a female, later renamed Norberta, was one of the hardest things Hagrid had ever done. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, dear listener. That story belongs to a later chapter, to a time when Harry Potter would return to the wizarding world and Hagrid's life would change forever. For now, let us return to the long, quiet years, the decades between Hagrid's expulsion and Harry's arrival, when Hagrid lived simply, loved deeply, and tended to the grounds and creatures of Hogwarts with a devotion that asked for nothing in return. The 1970s brought a shadow to the wizarding world, a darkness that spread slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Lord Voldemort, though many feared to speak his name, rose to power, gathering followers who called themselves Death Eaters, spreading terror and death throughout Britain. Hagrid heard the rumours, read the reports in the Daily Prophet that Dumbledore sometimes shared with him. Families going missing, muggles murdered for sport, wizards and witches who opposed Voldemort found dead, or worse, placed under the Imperious curse and made to do terrible things against their will. Hogwarts remained a sanctuary, protected by Dumbledore's power and the ancient magic woven into the very stones. But even there, the tension was palpable. Students returned from holidays with haunted eyes, having lost parents or siblings. Professors spoke in hushed voices in the corridors. The ministry, ineffectual and corrupt, seemed unable or unwilling to stop the tide of violence. Dumbledore formed a secret organization to fight back, the Order of the Phoenix. And though he did not share all its secrets with Hagrid, he trusted him with certain tasks. Hagrid carried messages too sensitive to send by owl, retrieved hidden packages from dangerous locations, and once, memorably, escorted a family of Muggleborns to a safe house in Wales when Death Eaters had targeted them. Hagrid was not a fighter. His broken wand and lack of formal magical education made him unsuited for dueling, but he was loyal, brave, and discreet. And his giant heritage, usually a source of shame, became an asset. He could go places others couldn't, lift things others couldn't, intimidate when necessary, without ever raising a wand. The war years were dark and frightening, but Hagrid did what he could. He kept the castle grounds safe, watching for intruders, reporting anything suspicious to Dumbledore. He continued to care for the creatures, finding solace in their simple needs, their uncomplicated trust. And then, on a October night in 1981, everything changed. Hagrid was in his hut, stoking the fire and preparing to go to bed, when an owl arrived. Not the usual school owl, but a large eagle owl that carried Dumbledore's seal. The message was brief and urgent. "Come to my office immediately. Bring your coat. There is work to be done this night that only you can do." Hagrid's stomach twisted with apprehension. He threw on his moleskin overcoat, grabbed his pink umbrella, and hurried up to the castle, his breath misting in the cold autumn air. Dumbledore's office was in one of the towers, reached by a spiral staircase guarded by a stone gargoyle. Hagrid gave the password, Fizzing Whizbee, and climbed. Dumbledore was standing by the window when Hagrid entered, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He turned, and Hagrid was startled to see tears on the headmaster's face. "Sir, what's happened?" "Sit down, Rubeus," Dumbledore said quietly, though there was no chair large enough for Hagrid, so he remained standing. "I have news, terrible news, and wonderful news, and they are so intertwined that I cannot separate one from the other." He paused, collecting himself. "Voldemort is gone, defeated. The war is over." Hagrid's heart leapt. "Gone? Yeah, dead?" "I mean gone," Dumbledore said carefully. "Destroyed, perhaps, though I cannot be certain. He went to Godric's Hollow tonight, to the home of James and Lily Potter. He intended to kill their son, a baby boy named Harry. But something happened, something unexpected. The killing curse rebounded. Voldemort was destroyed, and Harry survived. "Blimey," Hagrid breathed. "But James and Lily are dead," Dumbledore continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They died protecting their son. And now the son is alone, an orphan, the only person in history to survive the killing curse. He will be famous, Rubeus, more famous than he can possibly understand." Dumbledore turned to face him fully, and his expression was grave and determined. "I need you to go to Godric's Hollow. Sirius Black, James's best friend, will be there soon with his flying motorcycle. He will loan it to you. Take it and bring Harry to me. Bring him to number 4, Privet Drive in Surrey, to his mother's sister. He will be safe there. He must be safe there. Do you understand? Hagrid nodded, though his mind was reeling. You can count on me, sir. I know I can, Dumbledore said softly. Go now. And Rubeus, be gentle with him. He has lost everything this night, though he is too young to know it yet. Hagrid left immediately, his heart pounding. He made his way to Godric's Hollow, a small village in the West Country, and found the house easily. It was half destroyed, its roof collapsed, its walls blown outward, and a crowd of muggles were already gathering, staring at the ruins. Sirius Black was there, wild-eyed and distraught, holding a bundle wrapped in blankets. Hagrid, he said hoarsely, take him. Take Harry. Keep him safe. And take my bike. You'll need it. Hagrid took the baby, so small, so light in his enormous arms, and the motorcycle. And then he rose into the night sky, the engine roaring, the wind cold against his face. He looked down at the baby as he flew. Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He had his mother's eyes, Hagrid thought, though they were closed in sleep now, his small face peaceful despite the lightning bolt scar on his forehead. Don't worry, Hagrid murmured, his voice breaking. I'll keep you safe, Harry. I promise. And as the motorcycle carried them through the darkness, Hagrid wept. For James and Lily, for the war that had finally ended, and for the tiny child in his arms who had already lost so much. The motorcycle roared through the November night, its enchanted engine carrying Hagrid and his precious cargo high above the sleeping countryside. Below, the world was dark, save for the occasional scattered lights of villages and towns, their windows glowing warm against the cold. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath them, indifferent to the fact that everything had changed this night, that a war had ended, that a prophecy had been fulfilled, that a baby boy had survived the unsurvivable. Hagrid held Harry close against his chest, sheltering him from the wind with his great coat. The baby slept on, undisturbed by the roar of the engine or the rushing air, his small fist curled against Hagrid's chest, his breathing soft and steady. Every few minutes, Hagrid glanced down at him, checking that he was warm enough, that he was still sleeping peacefully, that the thin lightning bolt scar on his forehead, the mark left by Voldemort's curse, wasn't hurting him. Poor little thing, Hagrid murmured into the wind, his voice thick with emotion. Poor little Harry. Ye don't know it yet, but you've just as saved us all, and ye lost everything in the bargain. The tears that had been threatening since he left Godric's Hollow finally spilled over, streaming down his face and into his wild beard. He thought of James Potter, a good man, brave and loyal, who had died protecting his family. He thought of Lily Potter, brilliant and kind, whose love had somehow shielded her son even in death. And he thought of this baby, this innocent child who would grow up without parents, who would carry the weight of being famous before he was old enough to understand what fame meant. The night stretched on. Hagrid flew westward at first, away from the ruins of Godric's Hollow, then south and east towards Surrey. The motorcycle was surprisingly comfortable despite its appearance, the seat adjusting magically to accommodate Hagrid's size, the engine never faltering. Sirius Black had taken good care of it, Hagrid thought, and then wondered with a pang where Sirius was now, whether he had gone after Peter Pettigrew, the traitor who had betrayed the Potters to Voldemort. The sky began to lighten in the east as Hagrid approached the outskirts of London. Dawn was still an hour away, but the darkness was fading to deep blue, and the stars were dimming one by one. Hagrid descended carefully, following Dumbledore's directions, until he found himself flying over neat suburban streets, lined with identical houses, their gardens tidy, their cars parked in driveways, everything ordinary and muggle and utterly unremarkable. Number 4. Privet Drive was just like all the others, a square house with a neat lawn and a perfectly trimmed hedge, respectable and dull. Hagrid brought the motorcycle down gently in the middle of the street, its engine puttering to silence, and dismounted carefully, cradling Harry in one arm. Dumbledore was already there, standing beneath a street lamp that flickered and went out as Hagrid approached. Beside him stood Professor McGonagall, her expression stern but her eyes red-rimmed, as though she had been crying. "Hagrid," Dumbledore said softly, "you made good time. Any trouble?" "No, sir," Hagrid said, his voice rough. "He's been quiet the whole way. Hasn't woken once." McGonagall stepped forward, gazing down at the sleeping baby. "So this is the boy," she said quietly. "Poor dear, to lose his parents so young, and now to be left here, of all places." Her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "It is the safest place for him, Minerva," Dumbledore said gently. "His mother's blood runs in the veins of her sister. Ancient magic binds them. As long as he calls this place home, he will be protected from those who would harm him. But these people, Albus, I've been watching them all day. They're the worst sort of muggles. The boy would be better off in the wizarding world, where people know him, where he would be famous before he can walk, surrounded by those who would either worship him or resent him, never allowed to simply be a child." Dumbledore shook his head. "No, he needs to grow up away from all that. He needs to be normal for as long as possible. When the time comes, we will bring him back. But not yet." Hagrid listened to this exchange with a growing sense of unease. He looked at the house, dark and silent, not a single light showing welcome, and then down at Harry, still sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Are you sure about this, Professor?" he asked quietly. "Leaving him with these muggles? What if they don't treat him right? They are his family, Hagrid. They will care for him." Dumbledore's voice was firm, but there was something in his eyes, a sadness perhaps, or a resignation, that suggested he was not entirely certain of his own words. "Do you have the letter?" Dumbledore asked. "Right here, sir." Hagrid pulled a sealed envelope from his coat pocket and handed it over. Dumbledore examined it, then tucked it carefully into the blankets wrapped around Harry. "This explains everything," he said. "Who Harry is, what happened to his parents, and why he must stay here. I have also included instructions for his care and education, and a request, though I suspect it will go unheeded, that they treat him with kindness." McGonagall made a disapproving sound, but said nothing more. "Hagrid," Dumbledore said gently, "would you do the honor of placing him on the doorstep?" Hagrid swallowed hard. This was it then, the moment of goodbye. He looked down at Harry one last time, memorizing his small face, the curve of his cheek, the dark hair so like his father's. "Good luck, Harry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You'll need it, little one." He walked slowly to the front door and knelt, placing Harry gently on the doorstep, as though he were made of glass. The baby stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Hagrid arranged the blankets around him, making sure he was warm, and then stepped back, his heart aching. Dumbledore placed the letter on Harry's chest, and for a moment the three of them stood there in silence, looking down at the orphaned boy who had changed the world. "He'll be famous," McGonagall said quietly. "Every child in our world will know his name." "Exactly," Dumbledore said, "which is why it is all the more important that he grow up away from all that. Fame is a fickle friend, Minerva. Far better he discovers it later when he is old enough to understand it." He turned to Hagrid and placed a hand on his arm. "You have done well tonight, my friend. Now go and rest. You have earned it." But Hagrid couldn't move. He stood staring at the small bundle on the doorstep, his fists clenched, fighting the urge to scoop Harry up and carry him back to Hogwarts, to raise him himself in the warmth and safety of his hut, where he would be loved and protected and never lonely. "Hagrid," Dumbledore said again, more firmly, "it is time." Hagrid nodded reluctantly. He took one last look at Harry Potter, wiped his eyes with the back of his enormous hand, and turned away. He climbed onto the motorcycle, kicked it to life, and rose into the lightening sky, leaving behind the boy who had already survived the impossible, the boy who would one day change everything. Life returned to normal at Hogwarts, or as normal as it ever was in a castle full of magic and young witches and wizards. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. The Death Eaters had been rounded up and imprisoned in Azkaban, or had claimed they had been under the Imperius Curse and been pardoned. The wizarding world began to rebuild, to heal, to hope again. But Hagrid never forgot the baby he had carried through the night. He wondered about Harry often, especially on quiet evenings when the fire crackled in his hut and Fang snored at his feet. Was Harry being treated well? Was he happy? Did his aunt and uncle tell him about his parents, about the world he came from? Hagrid hoped so, though something about that cold, dark house on Privet Drive had filled him with unease. Whenever he asked Dumbledore about Harry, the headmaster's expression grew distant and thoughtful. "He is safe, Hagrid. That is what matters most. When the time comes, we will bring him home. But not yet. Not yet." The years passed in their slow, steady way. Students came and went, learning their magic, growing from uncertain first years into confident young witches and wizards. Hagrid watched them from the edges of their lives, tending the grounds, caring for the creatures, living his quiet, simple existence. He grew older, his beard growing greyer, his body aching on cold mornings in ways it never had before. But his love for Hogwarts never diminished, and his loyalty to Dumbledore remained absolute. He thought about Harry every October 31st, the anniversary of that terrible, wonderful night. He thought about him every July 31st too, Harry's birthday, wondering how old he was now, what he looked like, whether he had his mother's eyes or his father's unruly hair. And then, in the summer of 1991, as July drew to a close and Harry's 11th birthday approached, Dumbledore called Hagrid to his office once more. "It is time," the headmaster said simply. "Harry's letter has been sent, but the Dursleys have intercepted it. They have been intercepting all his letters, in fact, dozens of them. They are attempting to prevent him from learning about his heritage." Hagrid's hands clenched into fists. "They're what?" "They fear magic, and they fear that Harry will discover he is not ordinary. But we cannot allow this to continue. Harry turns 11 tomorrow, and he must know the truth. I'm sending you, Hagrid, to bring him that truth. Find him, tell him who he is, and bring him home." Hagrid's heart swelled with fierce joy. After 10 years of wondering, of worrying, of waiting, finally, he would see Harry again. "Where is he, sir?" Dumbledore's expression was grim. "His uncle has taken the family to a hut on a rock in the middle of the sea, hoping to hide from the letters. But magic always finds a way. Here are the coordinates. Take a boat if you must." And Hagrid, his eyes twinkled. "You might wish to bring a birthday cake." The storm was fierce that night, the wind howling across the dark water, rain lashing down in sheets. Hagrid rowed through it all, his powerful arms pulling the small boat steadily toward the distant rock, where a dilapidated hut perched like a seabird's nest, a single dim light showing in its window. He beached the boat on the rocky shore and approached the hut, his boots crunching on shells and stones. It was nearly midnight. Harry's birthday would arrive in minutes. Hagrid could hear voices inside, one of them angry and blustering, and his jaw tightened. If they had been mistreating Harry, if they had made his life miserable, he raised his enormous fist and pounded on the door. Boom, boom, boom. The voices inside fell silent. Then a man's voice, shrill with fear. "Who's there? I demand you leave at once. This is private property." Hagrid didn't bother answering. He simply pushed, and the door, flimsy and old, flew off its hinges and crashed to the floor with a tremendous bang. He had to duck to enter, his bulk filling the doorway, and he found himself looking at a scene that made his blood boil. A huge, beefy man with a large mustache, Uncle Vernon, obviously, was standing in front of his equally large wife and their enormous son, all three of them pale with terror and huddled in the corner, wrapped in a too large coat, his glasses held together with tape, his eyes wide with shock and confusion, was Harry Potter. Harry! Hagrid's breath caught. The boy had his mother's eyes, brilliant green, almond-shaped, startling against his pale face. His hair was his father's, black and hopelessly untidy, sticking up at odd angles. He was small, for 11, too thin, his clothes hanging off him like hand-me-downs several sizes too large, and on his forehead, just visible beneath his fringe, was the lightning bolt scar. "Sorry about that," Hagrid said gruffly, propping the door back in place as best he could. Then he turned to Harry and smiled, a great warm smile that lit up his entire face. "I haven't seen you since you was a baby, Harry, but you look a lot like your dad, except you've got your mum's eyes." Harry stared at him, speechless. Uncle Vernon, recovering from his initial shock, puffed himself up. "I demand that you leave at once, sir. You are breaking and entering. I will call the police." "Ah, shut up, Dursley. Yea, great prune," Hagrid said irritably. He reached into his coat and pulled out a slightly squashed box. "Couldn't make you a proper cake, Harry, what with travelling and all, but I got you this. Baked it myself. Words and all." He handed the box to Harry, who opened it with trembling hands to reveal a large, sticky chocolate cake with "Happy Birthday, Harry" written on it in green icing, the spelling slightly wonky, but the sentiment clear. "Thank you," Harry whispered, staring at the cake, as though he had never received a gift before. And perhaps, Hagrid thought, with a surge of anger toward the Dursleys, he hadn't now then. Hagrid said, settling himself on the sagging sofa, which groaned alarmingly beneath his weight. "Time you knew the truth, Harry. Time you knew what these muggles have been keeping you from you." "Muggles?" Harry repeated, confused. "Non-magic folk," Hagrid explained. "Your aunt and uncle here. They know all about magic, of course. Knew all about your mum and dad. knew what you are, but they tried to hide it from you, tried to stamp it out. What I am. Harry's voice was barely audible. Hagrid looked at him with surprise. Do you mean to tell me, he said slowly, that you don't know what you are? Harry shook his head. Vernon Dursley made a strangled sound. Stop, I forbid you. You can't stop it, Hagrid said calmly. He's had his letter. He's been accepted, and it's about time he knew. He turned back to Harry, and his voice softened. Harry, you're a wizard. The silence that followed was profound. Rain drummed on the roof. Wind rattled the windows, and Harry Potter stared at Hagrid with those green eyes, his mother's eyes, full of disbelief and dawning hope. I'm a what? He whispered. A wizard, Hagrid repeated. And a thumping good one, I'd wager. Once you've been trained up a bit, you're going to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. You've been accepted, had your name down since you was born. And then, as the clock struck midnight and Harry Potter turned 11 years old, Hagrid began to tell him the truth about magic, about Hogwarts, about his parents who had died heroes, about the terrible wizard who had tried to kill him and failed, about the fame that awaited him in a world he didn't know existed. Harry listened, his face cycling through shock and wonder and grief and excitement, and Hagrid's heart ached for him. This was too much, too fast, but there was no gentle way to overturn 11 years of lies. When he finished, Harry was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, his voice small, Did you know my parents? Knew 'em? Hagrid's voice broke. Everyone knew him, Harry. Your dad was head boy at Hogwarts. Your mum was one of the brightest witches of her age. They was brave, Harry. Brave and good, and they loved you more than anything in the world. Died protecting you. They did. Harry's eyes filled with tears, and Hagrid pulled out an absolutely enormous handkerchief, roughly the size of a tablecloth, and blew his nose with a sound like a foghorn. Sorry, he mumbled. Gets me every time thinking about it. It's all right, Harry said quietly, and then, to Hagrid's surprise, he smiled, a small, tentative smile, but genuine. Thank you for telling me, for the cake. You're welcome, Harry, Hagrid said gruffly. Now then, we'd better get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. Going to Diagon Alley, we are, to get your school things. Wands and books and robes and all. You're going to love it. He lay down on the sofa, which immediately collapsed beneath him, but Hagrid didn't seem to notice. Within minutes, he was snoring loudly, his coat pulled over him like a blanket. Harry remained awake much longer, staring into the darkness, his mind whirling with everything he had learned. He was a wizard. His parents had been murdered protecting him. He was famous in a world he'd never known existed. And tomorrow, his life would begin again. In the corner, wrapped in his coat, Harry Potter smiled, and for the first time in his life, he felt something very much like hope. Morning came grey and wet, but Hagrid was cheerful as he rowed them back to the mainland. Harry sitting across from him, his expression one of barely contained excitement. The Dursleys had tried to prevent him from leaving. Vernon had actually threatened to use force. But one look at Hagrid's face and one strategic use of the pink umbrella to give Dudley a pig's tail had convinced them to let Harry go. They took the train to London, Hagrid attracting stares from Muggles unused to seeing someone of his size, and made their way to a grimy little pub wedged between a bookshop and a record store. A pub that the Muggles passing by didn't seem to notice at all. This is it, Hagrid said proudly, the Leaky Cauldron. Famous place this. Inside, the pub was dark and shabby, filled with witches and wizards who looked up as they entered. For a moment, there was silence. Then someone whispered, "Bless my soul, Harry Potter." And suddenly, everyone wanted to shake Harry's hand. The barman, Tom, wrung it enthusiastically. A pale young man introduced himself as Professor Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts. Witches and wizards kept approaching, thanking Harry for things he didn't understand, and Harry looked overwhelmed and lost until Hagrid rescued him, steering him toward the back courtyard. "Told you, didn't I?" Hagrid said. "Told you Ye was famous." "But why?" Harry asked. "What did I do?" "You survived, Harry. You survived when no one else ever has. That makes you special." In the courtyard, Hagrid tapped the wall with his umbrella, 3 up, 2 across, and the bricks began to shift and fold, revealing the narrow, cobbled street of Diagon Alley. Harry's face was a picture of pure wonder. His mouth fell open, his eyes went wide, and he turned in a slow circle, trying to take in everything at once. The shops with their glittering windows, the cauldrons stacked outside the apothecary, the owls hooting from cages, the witches and wizards in robes of every colour, children dragging their parents toward the broomstick shop, the whole magical, impossible, wonderful chaos of it all. "This is amazing," he breathed. Hagrid grinned. "Told you. Now first stop. Gringotts. Got to get you some money." Gringotts, the wizarding bank run by goblins, awed Harry into silence. They descended in a cart that hurtled through tunnels deep beneath London, visiting Harry's vault, which was full of gold and silver coins, making Harry gasp. And then another vault, number 713, which Hagrid said was Hogwarts business, and wouldn't explain further. After that, they shopped. Robes from Madame Malkin's, books from Flourish and Blotts, a pewter cauldron, files of potion ingredients, and finally, most importantly, Ollivander's, the wand shop. Hagrid waited outside. The shop was too small for him, while Harry went in. It took a long time. Wand after wand, tried and rejected, until finally Mr. Ollivander found the right match. Holly and Phoenix Feather, 11 inches. The brother wand to Voldemort's. When Harry emerged, holding his wand carefully, his face glowing with happiness, Hagrid felt his eyes sting with tears. "Got your wand then? Good, good. Now, I got you a present." He handed Harry a large cage, and inside was a beautiful snowy owl with amber eyes, her feathers pure white, her gaze intelligent and kind. "She's beautiful," Harry whispered. "Thank you, Hagrid. I'll call her Hedwig." "You're welcome, Harry," Hagrid said gruffly. "Every wizard needs an owl, and she'll be good company for ye." They had lunch at the Leaky Cauldron, and then Hagrid escorted Harry back to the Dursleys, though it pained him to leave the boy there. "You'll be all right?" he asked, as they stood outside number 4, Privet Drive. "I will now," Harry said, smiling up at him. "Thank you, Hagrid, for everything." "See you at Hogwarts, Harry," Hagrid said. "September 1st, platform 9 3/4. Don't be late." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Harry Potter on the doorstep once more. But this time, Harry was smiling, his owl beside him, his future bright with possibility. Hagrid had brought him home. September 1st arrived with all the golden promise of autumn, and Hagrid stood on platform 9 3/4, watching the chaos of families saying goodbye, trunks being loaded, owls hooting from their cages, and young witches and wizards boarding the Hogwarts Express for another year. but his eyes searched for only one face in the crowd, a boy with untidy black hair and round glasses, a snowy owl in a cage, and a look of wonder on his face. And there he was. Harry Potter stood near the barrier, looking lost and uncertain, his trunk at his feet, clearly unsure of what to do next. Hagrid's heart swelled with relief and affection. He had worried, during the month since he'd left Harry at Privet Drive, that something would go wrong, that the Dursleys would prevent him from coming, that Harry would somehow be lost to the wizarding world again. But here he was, safe, ready to begin his journey. Hagrid didn't approach. There were too many people, too much attention, and Harry needed to find his own way among his peers. But he watched as a kind family with flaming red hair, the Weasleys, Hagrid recognized them, helped Harry find the platform and board the train. He watched as the express pulled away in a cloud of steam, carrying Harry toward Hogwarts, toward home, toward the destiny that awaited him. "Welcome back, Harry," Hagrid murmured to himself, smiling. "Welcome home." Didn't take long for Harry to find his way to Hagrid's hut, and when he did, on a crisp October afternoon just weeks into term, Hagrid's face split into a grin so wide it was nearly hidden by his beard. "Harry," he boomed, throwing open the door. Come in. And Ron, too. Ron Weasley. Isn't it good family, the Weasleys? Your dad worked with your father at the ministry, Ron Goodman, Arthur. Come in, both of you." The hut was exactly as Hagrid liked it, warm and cluttered, and smelling of wood smoke and cooking. A copper kettle hung over the fire, and Fang lay sprawled across half the floor, his tail thumping lazily as the boys entered. Hagrid bustled about, pouring tea that was so strong it was almost black, and producing a plate of rock cakes, so called because they were, indeed, nearly hard as rocks, though Hagrid had made them with love and didn't seem to notice when Harry and Ron had difficulty biting into them. "So," Hagrid said, settling into his enormous armchair, which creaked under his weight. "How you finding Hogwarts?" "Good, I hope. Gryffindor, both of you?" "I knew it. Knew you'd be in Gryffindor, Harry. Just like your dad." Harry smiled, his face lighting up in a way that made Hagrid's heart glad. "It's amazing, Hagrid. Better than I ever imagined. The classes, the castle, everything." "Even Snape's class?" Hagrid asked shrewdly, and Harry's smile faltered. "Well, maybe not that one." "Ah, don't you worry about Snape," Hagrid said, waving a massive hand dismissively. "He's got his reasons for being how he is. Brilliant man, though. Saved my life once, did Snape, when I was having trouble with a chimera in the forest. Nasty creatures, chimeras." Ron's eyes widened. "You fought a chimera?" "Well, not fought exactly," Hagrid admitted. "More like calmed it down a bit. They're not so bad once you understand them. Misunderstood. Most magical creatures are." And so began a pattern that would define Harry's years at Hogwarts. Whenever life in the castle became too much, when lessons were difficult, when Snape was particularly cruel, when the other students whispered about him being famous, when he simply needed a friend, Harry would make his way down to Hagrid's hut, often with Ron and later with Hermione too, and there he would find warmth and acceptance and tea so strong it could strip paint. Hagrid's hut became a sanctuary, a place where Harry could be himself, where he wasn't the boy who lived, but simply Harry, a boy who liked to hear stories about dragons and giants and Hagrid's adventures, a boy who needed, more than anything, someone who loved him without question or expectation, and Hagrid did love him. How could he not? He had carried Harry as a baby, had watched over him from afar for 10 years, had brought him home to the wizarding world. Harry was like the son Hagrid would never have, the family he had lost, and Hagrid would have done anything to keep him safe. It was during one of these visits, in the spring of Harry's first year, that Hagrid's love of dangerous creatures got him and Harry into considerable trouble. Hagrid had been acting strangely for weeks, disappearing for long periods, returning to the hut flushed and excited, refusing to say where he'd been. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had noticed, of course, and one evening when they visited, they discovered why. There, sitting in the middle of Hagrid's table in a nest of blankets, was an egg. Not a chicken egg, but something much larger, with a dull, mottled grey shell that seemed to pulse with internal heat. "Hagrid," Hermione said slowly, her eyes wide with alarm. Is that a dragon egg?" Hagrid's face flushed with guilty pleasure. "Norwegian Ridgeback," he said proudly. "Won it off a stranger in the pub last week. He seemed real glad to get rid of it. Can't think why. Beautiful egg, isn't it?" "Hagrid, you can't keep a dragon." Hermione's voice rose in pitch. "It's illegal and dangerous. They grow to enormous size and breathe fire and—" "They're not so bad," Hagrid said dismissively. "Just misunderstood, like I said. Besides, I've always wanted a dragon. Always. Ever since I was a boy. And now I've got one." His face took on a dreamy expression. "Gonna call him Norbert." Harry and Ron exchanged glances. They knew that look. Hagrid was besotted, and nothing they said would change his mind. The egg hatched 3 nights later, while Harry, Ron, and Hermione were visiting. They watched in awe and horror as the shell cracked, as a small black dragon, spiny and ugly and oddly endearing, fought its way into the world, smoke puffing from its nostrils. "Isn't he beautiful?" Hagrid breathed, tears streaming down his face. "Hello, Norbert. Hello, my boy." Norbert bit Hagrid's finger immediately, drawing blood, but Hagrid didn't seem to notice or care. He was in love. The weeks that followed were chaotic. Norbert grew at an alarming rate, doubling in size every few days, and Hagrid's wooden hut was entirely unsuited to housing a fire-breathing reptile. The furniture bore scorch marks. The curtains had been incinerated. Fang had taken to sleeping outside, too frightened to stay indoors. Hagrid fed Norbert rats and brandy mixed with chicken blood, sang lullabies to him, read to him from dragon breeding for pleasure and profit, and seemed utterly oblivious to the fact that he was courting disaster. "He's getting too big, Hagrid," Harry said gently one afternoon, watching Norbert knock over a chair with his thrashing tail. "Someone's gonna notice. And if the ministry finds out—" "No one's gonna find out," Hagrid said stubbornly. "I'm keeping him hidden, aren't I? He's just a baby. He needs me." But of course, someone did find out. Draco Malfoy, spiteful and cunning, spotted Norbert through the window one evening and immediately went to Professor McGonagall. The game was up. It was Hermione who found the solution. Ron's brother Charlie worked with dragons in Romania. He could take Norbert, give him a proper home where he could fly and hunt and be with others of his kind. It was the best possible outcome, but it meant Hagrid had to say goodbye. The night they smuggled Norbert out of the hut and up to the tallest tower to meet Charlie's friends, Hagrid wept openly, clutching a bottle of brandy and a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. "He's going to a better place," Harry said quietly, putting a hand on Hagrid's arm. "He'll be happy there, Hagrid. Happier than he could be here." "I know," Hagrid sobbed. "I know. But he's my Norbert, my baby boy. What if he forgets me?" "He won't forget you," Harry said firmly. "How could he? You saved him. You loved him." Hagrid nodded, blowing his nose with a sound like a trumpet. "You're a good lad, Harry. Your dad would be proud of you. So would your mum." Harry's eyes stung with tears, and for a moment, the two of them stood in the darkness. The half-giant groundskeeper and the orphaned boy, bound together by loss and love and the fierce loyalty that would define their friendship for years to come. The end of Harry's first year brought danger that Hagrid hadn't anticipated and a guilt that would haunt him for months afterward. It started innocently enough. Hagrid, visiting the Hog's Head for a drink, a rare indulgence, fell into conversation with a hooded stranger who seemed very interested in Hagrid's work at Hogwarts. The stranger bought him drinks, asked friendly questions, and seemed particularly curious about the protections guarding the Philosopher's Stone hidden in the castle. Hagrid, warmed by brandy and flattered by the attention, talked more than he should have. He mentioned Fluffy, the three-headed dog he'd loaned to Dumbledore to guard the trapdoor. He mentioned, casually, that Fluffy could be calmed by music. "Bit of heart music, and he falls right asleep," Hagrid said, laughing. "Gentle as a kitten, really. Just got to know how to handle him." He thought nothing of it at the time, just a friendly conversation with a curious traveller. But when Harry came to him weeks later, frantic and worried, saying that someone was trying to steal the stone, that Snape was involved, that they had to do something, Hagrid felt the first cold prickle of dread. "Harry, no one's going to steal the stone," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's too well protected. Dumbledore's taken care of everything. You don't need to worry." But Harry was insistent, and later that night, when Hagrid sat alone in his hut, trying to remember that conversation in the Hog's Head, he realized with dawning horror what he had done. He had told a stranger how to get past Fluffy. He had given away one of the protections, and if that stranger had been working for someone, if that stranger had been trying to help someone steal the stone. "Oh no," Hagrid whispered, his face pale. "Oh no, no, no." He ran to the castle, found Dumbledore, confessed everything, and Dumbledore, his expression grave but not angry, simply nodded and said, "I feared as much. Thank you for telling me, Hagrid. Now we must wait and see what unfolds." What unfolded was that Harry, Ron, and Hermione went after the stone themselves, faced terrible dangers in the chambers below, and Harry confronted Professor Quirrell, who was possessed by Voldemort himself. Harry survived, barely, and the stone was destroyed, and Voldemort fled once more. When Harry woke in the hospital wing days later, Hagrid was the first visitor, his face blotchy with tears, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in one enormous hand. "Harry," he choked out, "I'm so sorry. So sorry. It's my fault, all of it. I told a stranger about Fluffy, and he must have told Snape. No, not Snape, Quirrell. And you could have been killed, and it's all my fault." "Hagrid, stop," Harry said weakly, managing a smile. "It's not your fault. You didn't know, and I'm fine. We're all fine." "But you could have died," Hagrid insisted, tears streaming into his beard. "But I didn't," Harry said, "and the stone is safe. Voldemort didn't win. That's what matters." Hagrid nodded, unconvinced, and sat with Harry for hours, telling him about the end-of-year feast, about Gryffindor winning the House Cup, thanks to Harry's bravery, about how everyone was calling him a hero. But inside, Hagrid carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. His loose tongue had nearly cost Harry his life. He vowed, silently and fiercely, that he would be more careful in the future, that he would protect Harry better, that he would never, never let anything happen to the boy he loved like a son. Harry's second year brought the darkness that Hagrid knew all too well. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened again. The attacks began in November. Students found petrified, their bodies rigid as stone, terror frozen on their faces. Messages scrawled on walls in blood. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Hagrid felt the years fall away, felt himself transported back to his third year when he had been accused of the same crime, when his wand had been snapped and his life shattered. The fear was the same. The whispers in the corridors were the same. And worst of all, suspicion once again fell on those who were different, who were outsiders. Students whispered that it must be someone who could control monsters, someone with an affinity for dangerous creatures, someone like Hagrid. Harry defended him fiercely whenever he heard such talk, but Hagrid could see the doubt in some faces, could feel the old shame creeping back. He had been innocent before, and no one had believed him. Would history repeat itself? The Ministry certainly thought so. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic himself, arrived at Hogwarts in June with a contingent of officials and announced that Hagrid was to be taken to Azkaban, not as a convicted criminal, but as a precaution until the real culprit could be found. "I'm sorry, Hagrid," Fudge said, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "But with your history and the current situation, we simply can't take chances. You understand?" "I haven't done nothing," Hagrid protested, his voice breaking. "Not this time, not last time. I'm innocent." "Nevertheless," Fudge said, coldly. Dumbledore tried to intervene, but even he could not prevent the Ministry from exercising its authority. And so Hagrid was taken, shackled like a common criminal, led away from the only home he had ever known, while students watched from windows and whispered behind their hands. But before he left, he managed to say one thing, loudly enough for Harry and Ron to hear from where they stood, concealed beneath the invisibility cloak. "If anyone wants to find out anything, all they've got to do is follow the spiders. They'll lead you right. That's all I'm saying." It was a clue, a breadcrumb, a last desperate attempt to help solve the mystery. Before he was locked away, Azkaban was every bit as terrible as Hagrid had feared. The fortress prison stood on a desolate rock in the North Sea, surrounded by icy water and perpetual storm clouds. The Dementors, dark, hooded creatures that fed on human happiness, glided through the corridors, draining hope and warmth from everyone they passed. Hagrid's cell was tiny, barely large enough for him to lie down, and he spent his days huddled against the cold stone, trying not to think, trying not to remember, trying not to despair. The Dementors brought back his worst memories, his father's death, his mother's abandonment, his expulsion from Hogwarts, the look on Harry's face when he thought Hagrid had betrayed him. But through it all, he held on to one thought. Harry would figure it out. Harry would find the truth. Harry would save them all, and he did. Harry and Ron followed the spiders into the Forbidden Forest, found Aragog, ancient and enormous now, father to hundreds of acromantulas, and learned the truth. Aragog hadn't killed anyone 50 years ago. The monster in the chamber was something else, something far worse, a basilisk. Armed with this knowledge, Harry solved the mystery, saved Ginny Weasley from the chamber, destroyed the basilisk, and revealed that Tom Riddle, preserved in a diary, had been controlling everything. Hagrid was released immediately, his name cleared once and for all. He returned to Hogwarts gaunt and shaken, but overwhelmingly relieved. And the first thing he did was find Harry. "Yeah, it did it," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, pulling Harry into a crushing hug. "You figured it out. You saved everyone. I knew you would, Harry. I knew it. I couldn't have done it without your clue," Harry said, his voice muffled against Hagrid's coat. "The spiders, Hagrid. That was brilliant. Aragog came through," Hagrid said proudly. "Told you, he was a good sort, deep down. Well, maybe not good exactly, but loyal, and that counts for something." For Hagrid, the vindication was sweet, but bittersweet. 50 years he had carried the shame of a crime he didn't commit. 50 years people had looked at him with suspicion and doubt. And now, finally, everyone knew the truth. He was innocent. He had always been innocent. And Tom Riddle, who had framed him, who had destroyed his life, had been evil from the very beginning. Harry's third year brought a new challenge, and for Hagrid, it was both a dream come true and a nightmare unfolding. Dumbledore had decided that Hagrid, after decades of loyal service, deserved recognition. He appointed Hagrid as the official Care of Magical Creatures professor, replacing the retiring Professor Kettleburn. Hagrid was overwhelmed with joy and terror in equal measure. Me? A professor? But I never even finished school. What if I mess it up? What if the students don't respect me? What if... "You will be wonderful," Dumbledore said firmly. "You know more about magical creatures than anyone I have ever met, and you have a gift for connecting with them. The students will be fortunate to learn from you." And so Hagrid prepared his first lesson with meticulous care. He chose hippogriffs, magnificent creatures, half horse and half eagle, proud and powerful and deeply misunderstood. He wanted to show his students that even dangerous creatures could be approached safely, could be befriended if you treated them with respect. The lesson began well. Hagrid introduced the class to Buckbeak, a beautiful grey hippogriff with fierce orange eyes and a regal bearing. Harry approached correctly, bowed, waited for Buckbeak to bow back, and was rewarded with a flight around the paddock that left him breathless and grinning. But then Draco Malfoy, arrogant and foolish, ignored Hagrid's instructions. He insulted Buckbeak, approached carelessly, and the hippogriff, reacting to the perceived disrespect, lashed out with his talons, slashing Malfoy's arm. The injury was minor, easily healed, but the consequences were devastating. Lucius Malfoy, Draco's father, filed a formal complaint with the Ministry. He demanded that Buckbeak be destroyed and that Hagrid be dismissed from his teaching position. The Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures scheduled a hearing, and Hagrid, heartbroken and terrified, knew that Buckbeak would be executed unless a miracle occurred. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the darkest Hagrid had known since Azkaban. He spent every free moment with Buckbeak, grooming his feathers, feeding him his favorite treats, ferrets mostly, and talking to him in a low, soothing voice. "It's not your fault," Hagrid whispered, his face buried in Buckbeak's neck. "You're a good boy, the best. It's Malfoy's fault, the little git, and his father's for being a cruel, heartless..." He broke off, unable to continue, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione did everything they could to help. They researched legal precedents, prepared a defense, accompanied Hagrid to the hearing in London. But it was hopeless. The committee was biased. Lucius Malfoy had connections, and the verdict was decided before they even entered the room. Buckbeak was sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled for sunset. The executioner, a man named McNair, would use an axe, quick and brutal and final. Hagrid spent the last hours with Buckbeak in the paddock, his face wet with tears, unable to believe that he was about to lose another creature he loved, that once again his affection for misunderstood creatures would end in tragedy. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stayed with him until the very end, or so they thought. But then something extraordinary happened, something that involved time turners and second chances. And when Hagrid returned to the paddock after facing the executioner, Buckbeak was gone, escaped, vanished, somehow freed. Hagrid stood in the empty paddock, staring at the place where Buckbeak had been, and for a moment he couldn't process it. Then he laughed, a wild, relieved, disbelieving laugh, and sank to his knees in the grass, sobbing with joy. "He's free," he whispered. "He's free." He never knew exactly how it happened, though he suspected Dumbledore had something to do with it, and Harry had a strange knowing look in his eyes when Hagrid thanked him later. But it didn't matter. Buckbeak was alive and free, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Harry's 4th year at Hogwarts brought a spectacle unlike any the castle had seen in generations. The Triwizard Tournament, a legendary competition between 3 of Europe's greatest magical schools. Champions would be selected, dangerous tasks would be undertaken, and eternal glory awaited the victor. The castle buzzed with excitement as students from Beauxbatons Academy and Durmstrang Institute arrived in their magnificent fashions. One school in a powder blue carriage pulled by winged horses, the other in a great ship that rose from the Black Lake. Hagrid watched it all with mixed feelings of wonder and apprehension. He had responsibilities now, helping to prepare the creatures for the tasks, maintaining the grounds for the influx of visitors, and most unexpectedly, finding himself the subject of romantic interest. Olympe Maxime, the headmistress of Beauxbatons, was a woman of extraordinary height, nearly as tall as Hagrid himself, elegant and dignified in her flowing robes, her hair swept up in an elaborate style. When they first met, Hagrid was utterly tongue-tied, his face flushing scarlet beneath his wild beard. Madame Maxime, he managed, executing an awkward bow. "Welcome to Hogwarts, Monsieur Hagrid," she replied, her voice rich and accented, her dark eyes appraising him with interest. "It is a pleasure. I've heard much about you and your work with the magical creatures." For the first time in his life, Hagrid found himself caring about his appearance. He combed his hair, or attempted to, given its wild nature. He bought a new shirt, tried to trim his beard into something resembling order, and even dabbed on some cologne that smelled vaguely of pine cones and made Fang sneeze explosively. Harry, Ron, and Hermione watched these preparations with poorly concealed amusement and genuine affection. "You look very nice, Hagrid," Hermione said kindly, though his hairy brown suit was still several sizes too small and his tie was knotted incorrectly. "Do you really think so?" Hagrid asked anxiously, attempting once more to flatten his hair. "I don't want to embarrass her like. She's such a lady." The Yule Ball, held on Christmas night as part of the tournament festivities, was Hagrid's moment of glory. He escorted Madame Maxime into the great hall, which had been transformed into a winter wonderland of ice sculptures and enchanted snow. They danced, or rather attempted to dance, their combined size making the endeavor somewhat hazardous to other couples, but neither seemed to care. They were lost in conversation, discovering their shared love of magical creatures, their similar experiences of being different, of being judged for their size. "I am, how you say," big-boned Madame Maxime said delicately when someone rudely asked about her height. "My mother was very large. It runs in the family Hagrid, who recognized the evasion for what it was, a denial of giant heritage, felt a small pang of disappointment, but said nothing. He understood. The wizarding world was not kind to those with giant blood. If she needed to pretend, who was he to judge? But the tournament, for all its pageantry and excitement, ended in tragedy. The final task, a maze filled with magical obstacles, resulted in Harry and Cedric Diggory being transported to a graveyard where Voldemort awaited. Cedric was murdered. Harry barely escaped. And Voldemort, using Harry's blood in a dark ritual, returned to his body, alive again, powerful again, ready to resume the war he had begun 13 years earlier. The wizarding world didn't want to believe it. The Ministry denied it. The Daily Prophet called Harry a liar and Dumbledore a fool. But Hagrid knew the truth the moment he saw Harry's face, white with shock, haunted by what he had witnessed. "He's back, isn't he?" Hagrid said quietly, sitting with Harry in the hospital wing while Madame Pomfrey fussed over the boy's injuries. Harry nodded, unable to speak. Hagrid reached out and placed one enormous hand on Harry's shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "We got through it before, and we'll do it again. Dumbledore's got a plan. You can count on that. And I'll be here, Harry. Whatever you need. Always." And he meant it with every fibre of his being. That summer, while Harry was trapped at Privet Drive and the Ministry buried its head in the sand, Dumbledore reformed the Order of the Phoenix, the secret organization dedicated to fighting Voldemort. The members were few but loyal. Former students, trusted professors, allies from across the wizarding world. And Dumbledore had a mission that only Hagrid could undertake. "I need you to travel to the giant colonies," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes grave behind his half-moon spectacles. "Voldemort will attempt to recruit them to his cause, as he did in the First War. Giants are powerful, Hagrid, dangerous. If they join him, the consequences will be catastrophic. We must reach them first." Hagrid's stomach twisted. The giants, his mother's people, the tribes he had never known, who lived in the remote mountains where wizarding law could not reach them, where violence and strength were the only currencies that mattered. "Sir," Hagrid said slowly, "I don't know if they'll listen to me. I'm half-blood. They don't think much of a half-bloods. Which is precisely why you must try," Dumbledore said gently. "You understand them in ways no full human ever could, and you will not go alone. Madame Maxime has agreed to accompany you." Hagrid's heart lifted despite his fear. Olympe, she would come with him. Perhaps she trusted him after all. Perhaps she understood what he was, what they both were, and was ready to stop pretending. The journey to the mountains took weeks. They traveled in secret, using portkeys and broomsticks, and in the final leg, simply walking through treacherous mountain passes where the air was thin and cold and the paths were barely more than suggestions carved into stone. They brought gifts, Gringotts forged goblin helmets, each engraved with elaborate designs meant as tributes to the giant leaders. When they finally found the colony, Hagrid's breath caught in his throat. There were perhaps 70 or 80 giants gathered in a crude encampment, enormous beings, some 20 feet tall or more, their skin weathered and scarred, their eyes hard and suspicious. They wore animal skins and crude armor, carried massive clubs and stone weapons, and regarded the two visitors with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. The Gurg, the giant chief, was named Carcass, a relatively progressive leader by giant standards. He received them with wary interest, accepted their gifts, and agreed to listen to their message. For 3 nights, Hagrid and Olympe sat by the giants' fires, speaking through an interpreter, explaining that Dumbledore offered alliance and friendship, that the wizarding world was changing, that giants need not be enemies. Carcass seemed receptive. He asked thoughtful questions, considered their words. Hope bloomed in Hagrid's chest. Perhaps this mission would succeed after all. But on the 4th morning, everything fell apart. A challenge had been issued in the night. Golgamath, the largest and most brutal of the giants, had fought Carcass and killed him, taking leadership of the tribe. And Golgamath had already made his allegiance clear. He would side with Voldemort, who promised the giants freedom to raid and pillage as they wished. Worse still, Death Eaters had arrived. McNair, the executioner who had tried to kill Buckbeak, along with several others. They brought gifts far more impressive than Hagrid's humble helmets, dark magic artifacts, weapons, promises of power and bloodshed. "You must leave," Olympe whispered urgently as the camp descended into chaos around them. "Now, Hagrid, before they kill us." But Hagrid had spotted someone on the edges of the camp. A giant smaller than the others, clearly young, perhaps 15 or 16 feet tall, with a vacant expression and a way of moving that seemed clumsy even by giant standards. The other giants mocked him, threw stones at him, drove him away from the fires. "Wait," Hagrid said. "Olympe, wait." He approached the young giant carefully, hands raised to show he meant no harm. The giant looked at him with eyes that held confusion and something else, something almost like hope. Hagrid spoke to him in halting giantish, words he had learned from books and from listening to the tribe. "Hello, I'm Hagrid. What is your name?" The giant tilted his head, processing this slowly. "Grob," he said finally, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Grob," Hagrid repeated. "That's a good name." And in that moment, looking into Grob's simple, lonely face, Hagrid made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Probably both. "Come with me," he said. "You don't belong here, Grob. They're not kind to you, are they? Come with me. I'll take care of you." How he managed to convince Grob to follow them, how he and Olympe managed to lead a 16-foot giant through the mountains and back to Britain, would remain one of the great mysteries of Hagrid's life. It involved much patience, many injuries. Grob had a tendency to grab things roughly, not understanding his own strength, and a great deal of determination. By the time they reached the Forbidden Forest, and Hagrid had settled Grob in a clearing deep within the trees, Olympe was exhausted, injured, and had made her feelings clear. "You are mad, Hagrid," she said, though there was affection beneath the exasperation. "Completely mad, but also brave and kind. And I understand now why Dumbledore trusts you." She kissed him on the cheek, a gesture that made Hagrid's face burn scarlet and then she departed for Beauxbatons, leaving Hagrid alone with his new responsibility, a giant brother named Grob. Grob was, to put it mildly, a handful. He was not malicious, but he was rough and simple-minded and had no concept of gentleness or restraint. He pulled up trees by their roots to use as clubs. He broke branches off oaks to scratch his back. He grabbed Hagrid with bruising force whenever he wanted attention, leaving Hagrid covered in cuts and bruises that even Madame Pomfrey's healing potions struggled to mend quickly. But Hagrid persisted, driven by love and stubbornness in equal measure. Grob was his brother, well, half-brother, technically, as they shared a mother, Fridwulfa, who had left Hagrid for the giant colonies and had later given birth to Grob. Hagrid had spent his whole life wondering about his mother's people, wondering if he would ever find family among the giants. And now he had. Grob was family. Difficult, dangerous family, but family nonetheless. He built Grob a crude shelter in the forest, reinforcing it with magic so the 16-foot giant could have some protection from the weather. He brought food, whole sides of beef, crates of vegetables, barrels of water, and tried to teach Grob basic English words. Hagrid, he said slowly, pointing to himself. I am Hagrid. Can you say it? Hagrid. Grob stared at him with vacant eyes. Hagger, he said, finally, and Hagrid's heart swelled with pride despite the mispronunciation. Close enough, he said, beaming. That's good, Grob. Real good. He introduced Harry, Ron, and Hermione to Grob one afternoon, hoping they might help with the giant's education and socialization. It did not go well. Grob grabbed Hermione by her robes, lifting her off the ground while she shrieked in terror, fascinated by her bushy hair. Harry and Ron attempted a stunning spell, which bounced off Grob's thick hide without effect. Put her down, Hagrid roared. Grob, bad, put Hermie down. Grob, confused by the shouting, dropped Hermione, fortunately only from a height of about 6 feet, onto soft moss, and sulked in the corner of his clearing, making unhappy rumbling noises. Sorry, Hagrid said, helping Hermione to her feet. He don't mean no harm. He's just learning. Learning to kill us, Ron muttered. But Hermione, ever compassionate, brushed herself off and approached Grob again, speaking softly. Hello, Grob. I'm Hermione. Her, my own knee. Can you say it? Grob peered at her with interest. Hermie, he said slowly. Hermione smiled despite her fear. Close enough. And so, gradually, with infinite patience and considerable danger, Hagrid taught Grob basic language, basic manners, and basic understanding of boundaries. It was exhausting work made harder by the fact that Hagrid had to hide Grob's presence from most of the castle. If the Ministry discovered there was a giant in the Forbidden Forest, they would demand Grob be removed or destroyed. But Hagrid persevered, because that's what Hagrid did. He loved creatures that no one else loved. He protected those who couldn't protect themselves, and Grob, for all his difficulties, was worth protecting. Harry's 5th year brought a new darkness to Hogwarts, one that wore pink cardigans and spoke in a soft, girlish voice that barely concealed pure malice. Dolores Umbridge, appointed by the Ministry as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and later as High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, was dedicated to bringing the school under Ministry control and silencing anyone who claimed Voldemort had returned. She set her sights on Hagrid almost immediately. His lessons, she declared, were dangerous and inappropriate. His teaching methods were unorthodox, His very presence at Hogwarts was questionable, given his half-giant heritage and criminal record. Never mind that he had been innocent of the charges. She began attending his classes, sitting on a tree stump with a clipboard, making notes and asking pointed questions designed to make him look incompetent. "Tell me, Hagrid," she said in her saccharine voice during one lesson on thestrals, skeletal, winged horses visible only to those who had seen death. "Do you really think it's appropriate to teach children about creatures classified as dangerous by the Ministry?" "They're not dangerous if you treat them with respect," Hagrid said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. He hated being watched, judged, found wanting. Thestrals are gentle creatures, loyal. They've been used by the Ministry itself for... "I'll thank you not to tell me what the Ministry uses," Umbridge interrupted sweetly. "I'm quite familiar with Ministry policy, having worked there for many years, unlike some people here who lack formal qualifications." Hagrid's face flushed with shame and anger, but he held his tongue. Dumbledore had warned him, "Do not give Umbridge any excuse to dismiss you. Be patient, be cautious." But it was hard, so very hard. She increased her inspections, appearing at random times, criticizing everything, the way he handled the creatures, the content of his lessons, even his appearance. She placed him on probation, threatened to dismiss him, and made it clear that his position hung by a thread. The breaking point came late one night in the spring, when Umbridge, backed by Ministry officials and auras, attempted to remove Dumbledore from the castle. Hagrid, hearing the commotion, rushed to help and found himself facing stunning spells from 6 different wands. "Get back, half-breed," one of the auras shouted. Hagrid's anger, usually so carefully controlled, finally broke free. "You've got no right," he roared, his voice like thunder. "He's done nothing wrong. None of us have." 4 stunning spells hit him simultaneously. They should have knocked him unconscious instantly, would have, for any normal wizard. But Hagrid's giant heritage gave him resistance to magic. He staggered but remained standing, reaching for his pink umbrella. Then Professor McGonagall ran to his defense, and she was not protected by giant blood. 4 stunning spells hit her square in the chest, and she fell like a puppet with cut strings. "No!" Hagrid's bellow shook the castle windows. He scooped up McGonagall's unconscious form, cradling her gently despite his rage, and ran. He ran through the grounds, into the forest, away from the castle he loved, because he knew if he stayed, he would hurt someone, and he was not a violent man despite his size. Fang followed him, barking frantically, and together they disappeared into the darkness of the Forbidden Forest, leaving Umbridge victorious and Hogwarts diminished by his absence. Hagrid remained in hiding through the end of the school year, living rough in the forest, tending to Grob, and receiving supplies from members of the Order of the Phoenix. He heard about Umbridge's continued reign of terror, about Harry forming a secret defense group called Dumbledore's Army, about the increasing tension between the Ministry and those who believed Voldemort had returned. And then, in June, everything came to a head. Harry and several of his friends were lured to the Department of Mysteries in London by a false vision. Death Eaters attacked. A battle erupted. And in the end, the Ministry finally had to acknowledge the truth. Voldemort was back. Umbridge fled Hogwarts in disgrace, and Hagrid returned to find the castle in mourning. Not for deaths, the students had survived miraculously, but for what came next. The following year, Dumbledore died. It happened at the end of Harry's 6th year. Draco Malfoy, coerced by Voldemort into a terrible task, brought Death Eaters into the castle, a battle on the Astronomy Tower, and Severus Snape, whom Dumbledore had trusted absolutely, cast the killing curse. Albus Dumbledore fell from the tower and died. Hagrid found him. He had been in the forest, alerted by the dark mark hanging over the castle, like a skull made of sickly green light, and he ran toward the commotion, his heart pounding with dread. And there, at the base of the tower, lay Dumbledore, still, silent, gone. "No," Hagrid whispered, falling to his knees. "No, no, no. Not yet. Not yet, Professor." He gathered Dumbledore's body in his arms, carefully, gently, as though the old wizard was simply sleeping, and carried him back to the castle. Tears streamed down his face, disappearing into his beard, and his whole body shook with the force of his grief. Dumbledore had given him everything: a home when he had nowhere to go, a purpose when he felt worthless, trust when the world had judged him guilty, friendship when he was alone, and now he was gone. The funeral was held on the shores of the Black Lake, beneath a sky of cloudless blue that seemed cruel in its beauty. Hundreds attended: students, teachers, ministry officials, members of the magical community from across Britain and beyond. They sat in rows of chairs facing the lake, and at the front, in a marble tomb, lay Dumbledore. Hagrid was given the honor of carrying the body to its final resting place. He walked slowly, his head bowed, his grief a physical weight, and gently, so gently, placed Dumbledore in the tomb. White flames erupted around it, and when they cleared, the tomb was sealed. Harry found Hagrid afterward, standing alone at the edge of the forest, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hagrid," Harry said quietly, his own eyes red-rimmed. "He was the greatest man I ever knew," Hagrid choked out. "The greatest wizard, the greatest friend. And now he's gone, and I don't know what we're going to do without him, Harry." Harry placed a hand on Hagrid's arm. "We're going to keep fighting," he said firmly, "because that's what he would want. And you'll be there with us, Hagrid. You'll fight like you always have. And we'll win. For him." Hagrid nodded, unable to speak, and together they stood in silence, mourning the man who had saved them both, who had believed in them when no one else would, who had given his life to protect the future of the wizarding world. The war was coming. The darkest days lay ahead. But they would face it together. The darkest year. The year following Dumbledore's death was the darkest the wizarding world had known since Voldemort's first rise to power. The Ministry fell in a silent coup. Cornelius Fudge was ousted, and in his place came puppets controlled by Death Eaters operating in the shadows. The new regime wasted no time in implementing a reign of terror disguised as order and security. Hogwarts, that ancient sanctuary of learning and magic, was not spared. Severus Snape was appointed headmaster. The man who had murdered Dumbledore now controlled the school. Death Eaters walked the corridors as teachers. Alecto and Amicus Caro, siblings whose idea of education involved torture and cruelty, who taught dark arts rather than defense against them, who punished students with Cruciatus curses for the smallest infractions. Hagrid watched it all with a fury that burned like coals in his chest, carefully banked but never extinguished. He was one of the few staff members who remained from the old guard. McGonagall stayed. trying desperately to protect the students from within. Flitwick remained. Sprout tended her plants and her students with equal care. But they were powerless against the new order, forced to stand by while children suffered, while the values Dumbledore had championed were systematically destroyed. Hagrid did what he could. He sheltered students who came to his hut bloodied from punishments, offered comfort and rock cakes and a listening ear. He hid first years who were too frightened to return to their dormitories. He smuggled supplies to the students who had formed a resistance within the castle. Neville Longbottom, leading the reconstituted Dumbledore's army, keeping hope alive in the room of requirement when everything else seemed lost. But Harry was gone. Ron and Hermione too. They had not returned for their 7th year, and Hagrid had no idea where they were or what they were doing. Dumbledore had given Harry a mission before he died. That much Hagrid knew, but the details remained a mystery, and the not knowing gnawed at him constantly. Were they safe? Were they alive? Would he ever see them again? The year dragged on in a nightmare of fear and oppression. Students disappeared, taken by Death Eaters for having the wrong blood status or the wrong family connections. The Muggle-born Registration Commission demanded that anyone without proven magical heritage register with the Ministry, and those who refused were hunted down and imprisoned. Hagrid heard the rumors about Harry, that he was public enemy number 1, that the Carrows offered rewards to anyone who turned him in, that even speaking his name was grounds for punishment. But Hagrid spoke it anyway, defiantly, whenever he had the chance. Harry Potter's out there fighting, he told students who came to his hut seeking solace. He's fighting for all of us, and one day he'll come back. Yeah, mark my words. He'll come back, and when he does, things will change. They have terror. He had to believe it. The alternative was despair. It happened on a cold March evening when the forest was still locked in winter's grip, and frost glittered on the bare branches like scattered diamonds. Hagrid was checking on Grob. The giant had been restless lately, sensing the tension in the air the way animals often do before storms, when he heard movement in the underbrush, not the normal sounds of the forest, not deer or foxes or the centaurs on their patrol routes. Something human, someone trying and failing to move quietly through the trees. Hagrid's hand went to his pink umbrella, and he moved cautiously toward the sound, his heart hammering. Please don't let it be students, he thought desperately. Please don't let it be children wandering where they shouldn't be. But it wasn't students. A group of snatchers, bounty hunters who captured Muggle-borns and blood traitors for the Ministry, burst from the shadows, their wands raised, their faces cruel beneath their hoods. Rubeus Hagrid, their leader said, his voice rough and mocking. Half-breed gamekeeper, keeper of dangerous creatures, friend to Harry Potter and blood traitor Dumbledore. You're coming with us. I'm not going anywhere with the likes of you, Hagrid growled, raising his umbrella. You don't have a choice. The stunning spells came fast. 6, 7, 8 of them. Brilliant jets of red light that hit Hagrid from all sides. His giant heritage protected him from the first few, but even Hagrid's resistance had limits. The world tilted, his legs gave out, and darkness claimed him before he hit the ground. When he woke, he was bound with magical ropes that burned against his skin, lying in what appeared to be an old dungeon. The stone walls wept with moisture, and the only light came from a guttering torch in a bracket by the door. His head throbbed, and his mouth tasted of blood. "Where am I?" he mumbled, struggling against the ropes. "Malfoy Manor," a cold voice answered from the shadows, and a figure stepped into the light. Bellatrix Lestrange, wild-eyed and grinning, her wand pointed casually at his chest. "The Dark Lord wants to ask you some questions about Harry Potter. Where is he, half-breed? What is he planning?" "I don't know," Hagrid said truthfully. "Haven't seen him in months." "We'll see about that," Bellatrix said, and her smile widened in a way that made Hagrid's blood run cold. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and questions and defiant refusal. They used the Cruciatus curse, though it affected him less than it would have a full human, his giant blood providing some protection, and other, more creative methods of torture. But Hagrid told them nothing, because he knew nothing. He didn't know where Harry was. He didn't know what Harry was doing. And even if he had known, he would have died before betraying him. He thought about his father, who had raised him with love despite everything. He thought about Dumbledore, who had given him a home. He thought about Harry, the baby he had carried through the night, the boy who had become like a son. "I won't tell you nothing," he said through split and swollen lips. "You can kill me if you want, but I won't betray Harry. Not ever." Bellatrix's face twisted with rage, but before she could do anything more, there was a commotion upstairs, shouting, the crack of apparition, sounds of struggle. The Death Eaters rushed from the dungeon, leaving Hagrid alone in the darkness. He never learned exactly what happened that night. Later, he would hear that Harry had been captured too, along with Ron and Hermione, brought to the manor, and that they had escaped with the help of Dobby the house elf, who died saving them. But in the moment, all Hagrid knew was that eventually, hours or perhaps days later, time had lost meaning in the windowless cell. Aurors loyal to the Resistance broke into the manor and freed the prisoners they found there. Hagrid stumbled out into daylight, blinking and disoriented, his body a mass of bruises and burns, but alive, still alive, and with only one thought in his mind: he had to get back to Hogwarts. The final battle was coming. He could feel it, and he had to be there when it did. The call came on a May evening when spring had finally, tentatively, begun to soften the harsh edges of winter. The message spread through the Resistance network. "Voldemort knows where Harry is. He's coming to Hogwarts. Everyone who can fight must come now." Hagrid was in his hut, barely recovered from his ordeal at the manor, when he received word. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his moleskin coat, his umbrella, whistled for Fang, and headed for the castle at a run. The grounds were already in chaos. Protective enchantments shimmered around the castle like heat waves, erected by the combined power of the professors and order members. Students, too young to fight, were being evacuated through secret passages. Older students, those who had reached 17, the age of majority, were preparing to stay and defend their school. The air crackled with magic and tension, and the terrible anticipation of violence. McGonagall, now acting headmistress after Snape had fled, stood in the entrance hall directing preparations. When she saw Hagrid, her stern face softened slightly. "Hagrid, thank goodness. We need you on the grounds. The acromantulas in the forest. Can you control them? Keep them from joining the battle on the wrong side?" Hagrid's heart sank. The acromantulas. Aragog's children and grandchildren. Hundreds of them. massive and hungry and loyal to no one but themselves. "I'll try," he said, "but I can't make any promises. They don't listen like they used to." He went into the forest, into the deep darkness where the spiders made their home, and found them already stirring, agitated by the magical disturbances, drawn by the promise of food, human food. Aragog was long dead, and with him had died any restraint his descendants might have shown. "Please," Hagrid said, standing before the colony, speaking in the clicking language they understood. "Please don't attack the castle. There are children there, innocent people. Aragog wouldn't have wanted..." But they clicked and hissed and began to move toward the castle anyway, a tide of hairy legs and snapping mandibles, and Hagrid knew he had failed. He ran back to warn the others, his heart breaking. Even the creatures he loved most were beyond his reach now. Then the Death Eaters arrived. They came in a dark wave, appearing at the boundaries of the school grounds, hundreds of them, dark-robed figures with skull masks, wands raised, ready to destroy everything Dumbledore had built. At their head, though Hagrid couldn't see him from his position on the grounds, was Voldemort himself. The battle began with a sound like thunder, 100 spells cast simultaneously, crashing against the protective barriers, which held for a moment, then another, then began to crack and splinter and finally shatter like glass. And then it was chaos. Hagrid fought with everything he had. His umbrella sent jets of light that knocked Death Eaters off their feet. His fists, when enemies got too close, were as effective as any spell. He protected students who fell, carried wounded fighters to safety, and stood his ground when others fled. He saw Grob emerge from the forest, his brother drawn by the sounds of battle, confused but loyal in his simple way. Grob grabbed Death Eaters and threw them like dolls, swatted away spells with his massive hands, and bellowed challenges that echoed across the grounds. "That's my brother," Hagrid shouted with fierce pride, even as spells exploded around him. "That's my Grob." The centaurs joined the fight, their arrows flying true, and even the acromantulas, though they attacked both sides indiscriminately, created chaos that sometimes worked in the defenders' favor. But then came the moment that stopped Hagrid's heart. A magically amplified voice echoed across the battlefield. Voldemort's voice, cold and high and terrible. "Stop fighting. I have Harry Potter. He came to me of his own free will and surrendered. If you continue to fight, I will kill him and destroy you all. Come out and see what has become of your hero." The fighting ceased. An eerie silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of flames. Hagrid, his face streaked with soot and blood, felt his legs moving before his mind had decided, pulling him toward the forbidden forest where Voldemort's voice had originated. And there, in a clearing lit by the wands of Death Eaters, he saw them. Voldemort, pale and snake-like and triumphant, and lying on the ground, motionless, his eyes closed, his glasses askew. "Harry." "No," Hagrid whispered. "No, no, no." "You," Voldemort said, pointing at Hagrid with a long white finger. "Carry him. Let them see what happens to those who oppose me." "I won't," Hagrid said, his voice breaking. "I won't touch him. I won't." The Cruciatus curse hit him, and Hagrid fell to his knees, gasping, every nerve alight with agony. When it lifted, Voldemort's eyes were gleaming with malice. "Carry him, or I will make you suffer until you cannot remember what it felt like not to suffer. Hagrid, tears streaming down his face, stumbled forward and gathered Harry into his arms. The boy was small, so light, like the baby Hagrid had carried through the night 16 years ago. His skin was still warm, but he didn't move, didn't breathe. "Harry," Hagrid sobbed, cradling him against his chest. "Harry, no, please, no, not yet, not yet." "Silence," Voldemort hissed, and Hagrid choked back his grief, his whole body shaking with the effort. They forced him to carry Harry back to the castle, a terrible procession of Death Eaters and their captive, the conquered and the dead. Hagrid's vision blurred with tears, but he held Harry carefully, protectively, even in death trying to keep him safe. When they reached the entrance courtyard, when McGonagall and the defenders saw what Hagrid carried, the wails of grief that rose were like physical blows. Ron's scream, Hermione's sobs, Ginny's anguished cry, the sound of hope dying. "Harry Potter is dead," Voldemort announced, his voice echoing off the castle walls. "The boy who lived is dead. Your hero has fallen, and now you will kneel to me or die." But even as he spoke, even as despair threatened to swallow them all, Hagrid felt it, the smallest movement. Harry's hand, hidden against Hagrid's chest, twitched. His chest rose just slightly, with a breath. He was alive. Hagrid's eyes widened, but he forced himself to remain still, to show no reaction. Harry was alive and pretending to be dead, and that meant there was still hope, still a chance, still a... Harry's eyes opened. What happened next occurred in a blur. Harry leaped from Hagrid's arms. Neville Longbottom pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and killed Voldemort's snake, the last Horcrux. The battle resumed with renewed fury, and this time the defenders fought with the strength of those who have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Hagrid fought like a man possessed, his grief transformed into rage, his umbrella blazing with magic. He saw Harry duel Voldemort in the Great Hall. He saw the golden flash of the killing curse rebounding. He saw Voldemort fall, truly fall, his body hitting the stone floor with a sound like finality. And he saw Harry, alive, victorious, standing in the rubble of the castle he loved, surrounded by friends and survivors and the dawning light of peace. The days after the battle were strange and dreamlike. The dead were counted and mourned. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, and 50 others who had given their lives to defeat darkness. The wounded were tended. The castle was repaired, stone by stone, spell by spell, until it stood proud once more against the sky. Hagrid threw himself into the work. He cleared rubble, replanted gardens destroyed in the fighting, tended to traumatized creatures, and held funerals for the animals who had died defending their home, including several of the centaurs, and, to his deep sorrow, 3 of Aragog's children who had been killed by Death Eaters. Harry visited him often during those weeks, sitting by Hagrid's fire while the sun set over the forest, talking quietly about nothing and everything. "You did it," Hagrid said one evening, his voice filled with wonder and pride. "You really did it, Harry. You defeated him." "We did it," Harry corrected gently. "All of us, including you, Hagrid. You've been protecting me since I was a baby. You've never stopped protecting me. That's what family does," Hagrid said simply. "And that's what ye are, Harry. Family." Harry smiled, his eyes bright with tears, and leaned against Hagrid's shoulder, the way he used to when he was 11, and overwhelmed by the magical world. "You too, Hagrid. You've always been family." They sat in comfortable silence as night fell, and the stars emerged, one by one, over the forbidden forest. The years that followed were kind to Hagrid. He remained at Hogwarts as keeper of keys and grounds. McGonagall, now headmistress permanently, wouldn't hear of him leaving, and watched as a new generation of students arrived, laughed, learned, and grew. Harry became an Auror, then eventually head of the Auror department. He married Ginny Weasley in a ceremony where Hagrid cried so loudly he nearly drowned out the vows. They had 3 children, James, Albus, and Lily, and every single one of them came to Hagrid's hut for rock cakes and stories about their father's school days. "Is it true Dad fought a dragon?" James asked during one visit, his eyes wide with admiration. "Well, he didn't exactly fight it," Hagrid said, smiling. "More like flew around it a lot. But it was a Hungarian horntail, one of the most dangerous dragons there is, and your dad was as brave as they come." Ron and Hermione married too, and their children joined Harry's on visits to the hut. Neville became herbology professor and lived just down the corridor from where Hagrid kept his quarters when the weather was too foul for the hut. Luna travelled the world researching magical creatures and sent Hagrid postcards from every continent. Hagrid grew older, his hair and beard going entirely grey, his movements slower, his bones aching on cold mornings. But he never stopped loving the creatures, never stopped caring for the grounds, never stopped being the gentle giant who had carried Harry Potter through the darkness and into the light. Grawp remained in the forest, ancient now in giant years, placid and content. The centaurs allowed him to stay, recognizing that he meant no harm. Sometimes, in the evenings, Hagrid would visit his brother and sit with him in companionable silence. 2 beings who had never quite fit in the world they were born to, but had found peace anyway. On a soft September evening, many years after the battle, when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching autumn, Hagrid stood outside his hut and looked up at the castle. The sun was setting behind the towers, painting them in shades of amber and rose. Lights were beginning to appear in windows as students settled in for the evening. The sounds of laughter and chatter drifted across the grounds. Everything was as it should be. Inside the hut, his fire burned warm and welcoming. Fang, ancient now, white-muzzled and stiff, lay sleeping on his blanket. The kettle hummed on its hook. Rock cakes cooled on the table, ready for the visit Harry had promised to make later that week with his children. Hagrid felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him like a warm cloak. This was home. This had always been home. From the moment he arrived as a boy with nothing, to the decades he had spent protecting it, to this moment now, this was where he belonged. He thought of everyone he had lost along the way, his father, his mother, whom he had never truly known, Dumbledore, Aragog, Norbert, Buckbeak, who had flown away to freedom and never returned. So many creatures he had loved and lost, but he thought also of everyone he had saved, everyone he had helped, everyone he had loved who still walked the earth. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Neville, Grawp, Fang, the students he had taught, the creatures he had protected. His life, he realized, had been a good one. Not easy, not simple, but good. Full of love given and received, full of second chances and hard-won redemptions, full of the kind of magic that had nothing to do with wands and everything to do with kindness. He took one last look at the castle silhouetted against the dying light. then turned and entered his hut, closing the door gently behind him. The fire crackled, Fang's tail thumped sleepily against the floor, and Hagrid settled into his chair with a contented sigh, ready to rest, ready at last to sleep. In the years and decades that followed, Hagrid's story became legend at Hogwarts. Students would point to his empty hut, preserved by McGonagall as a memorial, and tell stories about the gamekeeper who had saved Harry Potter, who had loved creatures no one else could love, who had been expelled but stayed anyway because Hogwarts was his home. His portrait was hung in the entrance hall, where he could greet new students arriving for their first year. In the painting, he stood outside his hut with Fang at his side and the forest at his back, and sometimes, if you looked closely, you could see a dragon flying in the painted sky behind him. The forbidden forest, which had been his kingdom for so many years, remained wild and mysterious and full of the creatures he had protected. The centaurs spoke his name with respect. The unicorns remembered his gentle hands. And deep in the forest, in a clearing where the moonlight fell soft through the trees, Grawp lived on, tending the flowers that grew wild there, flowers that some said bloomed more brightly than flowers had any right to, as though magic itself remembered the man who had planted them. Harry's grandchildren would someday attend Hogwarts, and they would hear the stories too. They would learn about the half-giant who had carried their great-grandfather through the darkest night and into the light of morning. They would learn about loyalty and kindness and the courage it takes to be gentle in a world that often values strength above all else. And on quiet evenings, when the students were in bed and the castle was settling into sleep, if you stood on the grounds and listened carefully, you could almost hear it. The echo of footsteps too heavy to be human, the soft rumble of a voice speaking kindly to creatures in the darkness, the sense of a presence still watching over Hogwarts, still keeping it safe, still calling it home. For Rubeus Hagrid had never truly left. His love for the castle, for the students, for the creatures of the forest, had become part of the very stones and soil of Hogwarts. And love, as Dumbledore had once told him, was the most powerful magic of all, the kind that never dies, never fades, but lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every choice to protect rather than harm. The kind of magic that makes heroes not of those who wield the most powerful spells, but of those who love the most deeply. The kind of magic that was Hagrid's greatest gift to the world. And so, dear listener, our story comes to its end, not with sadness, but with the quiet contentment of a life well lived, a legacy well earned, a love that transcends time itself. Let yourself sink now into the softness of sleep, cradled by the knowledge that somewhere, in a world just beyond dreams, a fire still burns warm in a wooden hut at the edge of an enchanted forest. Rock cakes cool on a table. A dog snores peacefully, and a gentle giant with kind eyes watches over all he loves, forever and always. Let Hagrid's story remind you that you too are capable of extraordinary love, that kindness is never wasted, that loyalty matters, that the creatures and people others dismiss as different or difficult or dangerous are often simply waiting for someone to see them truly, to love them fully, to give them the second chance they deserve. Sleep now, dear listener. Sleep in the warmth of Hagrid's hearth. Sleep with the certainty that morning will come, that spring will follow winter, that light will always find a way to pierce the darkness. Sleep with the memory of a man who carried a baby through the night and changed the world. Sleep and dream of dragons,